In the forgotten depths of galactic history, there exists a tale so dark that even the Jedi archives dare not speak its full truth. Three figures emerged from the ashes of the greatest war the Republic had ever known. Three lords who did not simply conquer worlds, they consumed them. The first could not die. His body shattered 1,000 times, yet hatred alone kept him breathing, every wound a testament to agony that would not end. The second was hunger incarnate, a void wearing flesh. Entire civilizations vanished when his ship appeared in orbit, billions of voices crying out, then silence. Not even echoes remained. The third was the betrayer, the master who orchestrated it all. She who sought not to rule the galaxy, but to murder the very force itself. But here is what the histories will never tell you. Before they became monsters, they were victims. Before they devoured the Jedi Order, something devoured them, and the secret of what created these three Lords of Ruin lies buried in a wound so deep that reality itself screams around it. Tonight we unravel the complete timeline of the Sith Triumvirate. From the moment of their creation to their final inevitable fall, every betrayal, every world consumed, every Jedi who fell to their hunger. This is not just a story of villains, this is a chronicle of how the galaxy broke and what crawled out of the wreckage. Now, here is something interesting. Around 62% of you watching right now have not subscribed yet. If you are enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars lore, hitting that subscribe button genuinely helps this channel grow and lets me create more stories like this. Also, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Seriously, drop a comment. Are you winding down after a long day, or is this your late-night companion? Knowing there are fellow Star Wars fans across different time zones sharing this journey makes these stories even more special. Alright, dim the lights if you can, get comfortable under your blanket, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let us ease into this ancient tale together. Long ago, in a galaxy not yet scarred by the horrors to come, there was peace. The year was 3,976 years before the Battle of Yavin, before the Empire, before the Clone Wars, before even the tales of Darth Bane and the Rule of Two. This was the era of the Old Republic, and it stood as a beacon of civilization stretching across 1,000,000 worlds. Coruscant gleamed like a jewel at the heart of known space. Its endless cityscape of towers reached toward the stars, each spire a testament to thousands of years of prosperity. Skylanes hummed with traffic as beings from 1,000 species went about their lives, unaware that darkness was gathering at the edge of their perfect sky. The Senate chambers rang with debates over trade routes and planetary disputes, small problems for a galaxy that had forgotten what true catastrophe looked like. On the peaceful plains of Dantooine, the Jedi Enclave stood serene beneath twin suns, young Padawans trained in courtyards where ancient trees provided shade. Masters meditated in halls carved from stone, their connection to the Force as steady and reliable as the sunrise. The Jedi Order was at its peak, confident, proud, certain of their place as guardians of peace and justice. 10,000 Jedi Knights served the Republic, and the Order had not known true defeat in living memory. Delos thrived as a model of urban civilization. Its cities sparkled with innovation. Families walked safe streets. Children played in parks suspended high above the planet's surface. The restoration zones showcased how Republic ingenuity could terraform entire continents. It was a world that looked toward the future with optimism. But at the edges of this prosperity, something stirred. In the Outer Rim, beyond the reach of Senate law, the Mandalorian clans were gathering, warriors in armor passed down through generations, bound by codes of honor and combat. They watched the soft, peaceful Republic with contempt. They saw a galaxy that had grown weak, complacent, ripe for conquest. And deeper still, on worlds so remote that even the Jedi had forgotten their names. Ancient ruins waited in silence, tombs of the Sith Empire buried beneath centuries of dust and debris. Inside these forsaken temples, holocrons whispered in the dark, forbidden knowledge that should have remained lost, teachings that promised power beyond imagination, but demanded a price that few could comprehend. The Jedi Council, in their wisdom and their pride, sensed distant tremors in the Force, shadows moving at the periphery of their vision. But they dismissed these warnings. After all, the Sith had been extinct for 1,000 years. What threat could possibly challenge the Republic at its height? They would soon learn the answer, and the galaxy would pay the price for their blindness. The storm was coming. The invasion came without warning and without mercy. In the year 3976, before Yavin Mandalorian war fleets descended upon the Outer Rim like a plague of steel. These were not common pirates or raiders. These were the Mandalorian clans, united under a single banner for the first time in generations. Their leader, Mandalore the Ultimate, had forged dozens of fractured warrior cultures into an unstoppable war machine, and he had one goal: conquest. Worlds burned in the first weeks. The Republic Navy, unprepared for such coordinated brutality, fell back in disarray. Entire sectors went dark as communication relays were destroyed. Refugees flooded toward the core worlds with stories of cities reduced to ash, of Mandalorian shock troopers who showed no fear and took no prisoners. The Senate debated, the military scrambled to organize a response, and young soldiers died by the thousands on planets whose names most Republic citizens could not even pronounce. On Coruscant, the Jedi Council convened in their highest tower. They felt the disturbance in the Force. The screams of dying worlds echoed through their meditations like distant thunder. Master Vandar, Master Vrook, and the other senior council members understood what this war represented. It was not merely a military conflict. It was a test. The dark side thrived on violence and suffering. Every battle, every death, fed that ancient hunger, and the Council knew that Jedi who went to war risked something far worse than physical death. They risked falling to the very darkness they sought to defeat. So the Council made their decree. The Jedi would not intervene. They would observe. They would wait. They would trust that the Republic military could handle this threat without dragging the Order into a conflict that might corrupt them all. It was a decision born of wisdom and caution. It was also a decision that would doom the galaxy. Because not all Jedi agreed. In the training halls of Dantooine, a young Jedi Knight named Revan listened to reports of the war with growing fury. Brilliant beyond measure, charismatic in a way that drew others to him like gravity, Revan saw the Council's inaction as cowardice disguised as prudence. Worlds were dying, the Republic was losing, and the Guardians of Peace sat in their temples and did nothing. It was unacceptable. Beside him stood Malak, his closest friend, where Revan burned with righteous conviction. Malak smoldered with barely contained aggression, a warrior in spirit. He had always chafed against the Jedi Code's restrictions. The war gave him purpose, direction, a chance to prove his strength meant something. And among those who listened to Revan's arguments was a young Jedi named Mitra Surik. She would later be known only as the Exile, but in those days she was simply another knight troubled by the Council's passivity. She heard the cries for help through the Force and could not ignore them. When Revan spoke of duty, of protecting the innocent, of standing against evil even when the cost was high, she believed him with her whole heart. Their teacher watched from the shadows. Kreia was her name, though few knew her well. A master Jedi historian, she spent her days among ancient texts and holocrons, studying the patterns of galactic history. She was not a warrior or a diplomat. She was a scholar who understood that ideas shaped the galaxy far more than lightsabers ever could. And as she observed her students preparing to defy the council, she felt something she had not experienced in decades, pride mixed with dread. Revan came to her before he left, asked for her blessing, though they both knew he would go regardless of her answer. Chrysia looked into his eyes and saw a future branching into darkness and light simultaneously. She told him that the Force would guide him to his destiny. She did not tell him that destiny is often another word for doom. The Revanchists, they called themselves. Jedi who had pledged to redeem the Republic through action rather than meditation. Revan led them into battle, and the war turned almost overnight. His tactical genius was something neither the Mandalorians nor the Republic had ever encountered. He understood warfare, not as chaos but as a deadly, intricate dance, where every move created opportunities 3 steps ahead. He saved entire worlds with strategies that seemed impossible until they succeeded. He became a legend while still young enough to doubt himself in quiet moments. But war changes those who fight it. Every battle Revan won came at a cost measured in lives. He made decisions that saved millions by sacrificing thousands, calculated, necessary, monstrous. The line between pragmatic leadership and ruthless ambition began to blur. His connection to the Force grew stronger but darker, tinged with emotions the Jedi Code warned against. Anger at the Mandalorian's cruelty, pride in his victories, fear that he might not be enough to save everyone. Malak noticed the change before others did, but he said nothing because he felt it too. The intoxication of power, the way the dark side whispered that strength could solve any problem if only you were willing to embrace it fully. Years passed. The war ground on, and then Revan discovered something that would alter the course of galactic history. On the edges of known space, pursuing a fleeing Mandalorian fleet, Revan's forces stumbled upon a world that should not exist. Malachor V, even its name felt like poison on the tongue. A planet of black stone and crimson storms, it radiated wrongness through the Force. Reality seemed thin there, as if the barrier between the physical universe and something far worse had worn dangerously transparent. Revan ordered his fleet to maintain orbit while he investigated the surface alone. He found ruins. Vast complexes carved into the planet's crust, built by the ancient Sith Empire millennia ago. The Triumvirate Academy, it was called, a place where the dark side had been studied, not as an enemy to resist, but as a tool to master. Holocrons waited in sealed chambers, their guardians long since turned to dust, and when Revan activated them, they spoke with voices that promised answers to questions he had not even known to ask. Power, true power, beyond what the Jedi had ever imagined. Techniques that could break the will of entire populations, knowledge that revealed the Force not as a mystical energy field, but as something that could be shaped, controlled, weaponized. The holocrons did not tempt Revan with promises of evil. They tempted him with promises of victory, of finally having the strength to end the war and save the Republic once and for all. He spent weeks in those ruins, studying, learning, changing. When he emerged, something fundamental had shifted behind his eyes. He had gone into Malachor V as a Jedi walking a dangerous path. He came out as something else entirely, though he did not yet understand what. Revan became obsessed with the planet. He ordered Republic engineers to construct a weapon there, hidden in the deepest canyons, where sensors could not detect it. A superweapon unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Mass Shadow Generator. A device that could manipulate gravity itself, tearing apart entire fleets by creating artificial singularities. It was a weapon of absolute destruction, and Revan intended to use it to end the war in a single terrible stroke. He shared the plan with Malak and a handful of trusted commanders. The exile was among them. He told them it was necessary, that the Mandalorians would never surrender through conventional means, that sometimes peace required an act of unthinkable violence to prevent even greater suffering. The logic was sound, the reasoning impeccable. but the words came from a place that no longer resembled the hopeful young Jedi who had defied the Council years ago. The final battle was set. Revan would lure the entire Mandalorian fleet to Malachor V, and there, with the mass shadow generator as his instrument, he would end the war forever. The Republic would be saved, the Mandalorians would be broken, and Revan would finally prove that he had been right all along. But fate is rarely so simple, and Malachor V had not finished reshaping those who ventured into its darkness. The galaxy stood on the edge of a chasm, and it was about to fall in. The fleets arrived at Malachor V in the year 3960 before Yavin. Hundreds of capital ships, thousands of fighters, the largest naval engagement the galaxy had witnessed in living memory. Republic vessels painted in white and blue formed battle lines against the crimson and gray of Mandalorian war cruisers. Between them hung the planet itself, a sphere of torment that seemed to poison the very space around it. Malachor V was a world that should have been beautiful. Mountains of volcanic glass caught the light of its dying red sun and threw it back in fractured rainbows. Vast canyons carved through its crust revealed layers of geological history spanning billions of years. Storm systems larger than continents rolled across its surface in perpetual motion. But there was nothing beautiful about the wrongness that radiated from every atom of that cursed rock. The planet's surface was a maze of shattered stone and twisted metal. Ancient ruins jutted from cliffs like broken teeth. The Trius Academy dominated the largest canyon, a massive complex of dark stone chambers and meditation halls that had once housed the most dangerous Sith philosophers in galactic history. Even after millennia of abandonment, the architecture retained its menace. Archways shaped like screaming faces, corridors that seemed to shift when observed from the corner of one's eye, and deep beneath it all, meditation chambers where the dark side had been concentrated into something almost physical. The air itself felt thick on Malachor V. Breathing required effort, as if the atmosphere contained some invisible weight that pressed against the lungs. Force sensitives reported feeling watched constantly, hearing whispers in languages they did not recognize, sensing presences that vanished when confronted directly. Some claimed the planet was alive in a way that defied conventional understanding. Not conscious exactly, but aware, hungry. The Force behaved strangely there. Jedi found their abilities unpredictable. Lightsabers flickered, telepathic connections faded in and out like bad transmissions. It was as if reality had grown tired in that place, as if the fundamental laws governing existence had begun to fray at the edges. The dark side saturated everything so thoroughly that even mundane objects carried its taint. A simple stone picked up from the ground would feel cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Storms raged perpetually across the planet's equator. Not weather systems in any conventional sense, but manifestations of dark side energy given meteorological form. Lightning the color of old blood lashed between clouds that roiled with geometrically impossible patterns. The thunder that followed did not sound like natural atmospheric discharge. It sounded like screaming, like millions of voices crying out in languages predating known civilization. This was the battlefield Revan had chosen. This was where he intended to break the Mandalorian clans forever. The space battle began at dawn, local time. Mandalorian shock fleets struck first, their aggressive tactics designed to overwhelm through sheer ferocity. Republic forces held formation, trading firepower at ranges where shields could still offer protection. Ships died in brilliant flashes as reactors breached. Debris fields expanded with each passing minute, and far below, hidden in the deepest canyon on Malachor V, the mass shadow generator powered up to operational status. Mitra Surik stood on the bridge of her command ship, watching the battle unfold with growing horror. She had followed Revan into war believing they were saving the galaxy. But as the casualties mounted and the darkness of Malachor V pressed against her mind, Doubt crept in like frost. Something was profoundly wrong about this place. Wrong in a way that transcended simple danger. Being here felt like standing at the edge of an abyss that looked back with malevolent interest. Revan's voice came through her communicator, calm, measured, utterly certain. The Mandalorian fleet was committing fully to the engagement. Their entire war machine was now in orbit around Malachor Vir. This was the moment. The mass shadow generator was ready. All that remained was the order. And he was giving that order to her. Mitra Surik understood what Revan was asking. Activate the weapon. End the war. Save the Republic. Simple words for an action that would define the rest of her existence. She looked out at the battle, at the thousands of ships locked in combat, at the planet below, radiating malevolence like a wound in space, at the future branching before her into paths she could barely comprehend. She gave the order. The mass shadow generator activated with a pulse of energy that registered on sensors across 3 sectors. Gravity went mad. The fundamental force that held planets in orbit and kept atoms from flying apart suddenly became a weapon of unimaginable destruction. Artificial singularities bloomed like flowers of annihilation across the orbital plane. Ships were crushed inward, compressed to fractions of their original size in milliseconds. Others were torn apart as differential gravitational forces exceeded the tensile strength of their hulls. Malachor V's moon shattered. One moment it existed, a small rocky satellite that had circled the planet for billions of years. The next moment it was debris, fragments ranging from mountain-sized chunks to dust motes, all falling toward the planet in a spiral of gravitational chaos. The debris struck the upper atmosphere at velocities that turned rock into plasma. The entire planet lit up as if a second sun had appeared in its sky. The Mandalorian fleet died. Not retreated, not surrendered, died. Hundreds of capital ships and their thousands of crew members simply ceased to exist in a span of minutes. The few vessels on the edge of the gravitational anomalies tumbled out of control, their systems overloaded by forces their designers had never anticipated. Some crashed into Malachor V's surface, adding their wreckage to the ancient ruins. Others drifted away into deep space, lifeless hulks, carrying the frozen corpses of warriors who had died without understanding what killed them. But Republic forces died, too. The mass shadow generator did not discriminate. Gravity cared nothing for allegiance or intention. Ships bearing the Republic banner were crushed alongside their enemies. Pilots who had followed Revan into battle because they believed in protecting the innocent found themselves pulled into gravitational wells from which no escape existed. They died screaming. They died in silence. They died knowing they had been sacrificed as part of a strategy they had never been told about. The death toll was beyond calculation. Not thousands, not even hundreds of thousands. Millions of sentient beings extinguished in moments, and every single one of them was connected to the Force. Every death registered, every final moment of terror and pain echoed through that mystical energy field that bound all living things together. The Force screamed. Across the galaxy, Jedi collapsed as the wave of death struck their consciousness. Masters who had meditated peacefully for decades found themselves overwhelmed by visions of destruction. Padawans woke from nightmares they did not understand. Even non-Force sensitives reported feeling a moment of inexplicable dread, as if the universe itself had flinched. And at the center of it all, at the exact point where the mass shadow generator had torn reality apart, something happened that would echo through galactic history for the next 4,000 years. A wound opened in the Force itself. Not a metaphorical wound, an actual rupture in the fabric of the energy field that connected all living things, a place where the Force simply stopped existing, a void, a silence where there should have been the constant background hum of life and death and existence. It was as if someone had taken a knife to the universe and cut out a piece, leaving emptiness in its place. The wound fed on death. Every life extinguished around Malachor V made it deeper, wider, more permanent. It achieved a form of terrible self-awareness, a hunger without consciousness that nonetheless sought to consume. And it called to certain individuals, those who had been present at its creation, those whose actions had torn it into being. It marked them, changed them, made them part of itself in ways that transcended simple corruption. Mitra Surik felt it happen. The moment the wound opened, her connection to the Force severed completely, not blocked, not suppressed, simply gone, as if it had never existed. She had cut herself off reflexively, an unconscious act of self-preservation when confronted with the psychic tsunami of mass death. Better to be deaf than destroyed by that overwhelming scream. Her mind could not process the magnitude of what she had done, so it chose the only option that might allow her to survive. It chose silence. She would spend the rest of her life bearing that emptiness. A Jedi without the Force, a wound walking in human form, living proof of the terrible price Malachor V demanded from those who wielded its power. On the planet's surface, in the ruins of the Traeus Academy, Revan and Malak stood among the ancient holocrons and felt the dark side surge through them with intoxicating intensity. The war was won. The Mandalorians were broken. The Republic was saved. But the cost had been so much higher than either of them had imagined, and the teachings they had absorbed from those Sith holocrons suddenly made perfect, terrible sense. Power required sacrifice. Victory demanded ruthlessness, and the galaxy could only be truly saved by those willing to rule it without the weakness of mercy or compassion. The old Jedi teaching seemed naive now, childish. The dark side offered clarity, purpose, strength. They had gone to Malachor Vav as Jedi. They emerged as Sith Lords. The Mandalorian wars were over, but a new conflict was about to begin, and this time the enemy would not be foreign invaders. The enemy would be the Republic's own saviors, twisted into conquerors by the very act of salvation. Revan did not return to Coruscant in triumph. He returned at the head of an armada. In the year 3959, before Yavin, barely a year after Malachor V's catastrophe, Republic scout ships detected a massive fleet emerging from the unknown regions. At first, they assumed it was the Mandalorians regrouping for a final assault. Then the IFF transponders identified the lead vessels, Republic Navy, the ships that had followed Revan into the Outer Rim and never returned, and at their head, a flagship bearing the personal sigil of the Jedi who had saved the galaxy. Except Revan was no longer a Jedi. He had taken the title of Dark Lord of the Sith, claiming an ancient legacy that stretched back millennia to the fallen empire whose ruins littered the galaxy. Beside him stood Darth Malak, his right hand and apprentice. Together they commanded an army of Jedi who had fallen with them, knights who had fought so long and killed so many that the darkness no longer felt foreign, it felt like home. The message Revan broadcast to the Republic Senate was simple. The war had proven that democracy was too weak, too indecisive to protect its citizens. The Jedi Council's refusal to act had nearly doomed billions. Only through strong, centralized authority could the galaxy be saved from itself. He offered the Senate a choice: surrender peacefully and accept his rule, or resist and be conquered. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. The time for debate had ended. The Republic refused. Of course the Republic refused. Senators who had spent lifetimes building coalitions and crafting legislation were not about to hand power to a former Jedi, simply because he commanded a fleet. The military mobilized, defensive positions were established around key worlds, and the Jedi Council, horrified by what their wayward knights had become, prepared for a war they had desperately tried to avoid. The Jedi Civil War began with orbital bombardments of Republic military installations. Revan's strategy was methodical and brutal. He did not seek to destroy the Republic, but to break its will to resist. Fleets blockaded trade routes. Sith strike teams assassinated military commanders. Entire sectors switched allegiance when faced with the choice between submission or annihilation. It was conquest disguised as salvation, and it worked with terrifying efficiency. Malak led the ground campaigns with savage enthusiasm, where Revan maintained a veneer of reluctant necessity. Malak embraced the dark side's promise of absolute strength. He burned Jedi temples not because strategy demanded it, but because he enjoyed watching them fall. The apprentice was beginning to surpass the master in pure malevolence, though neither recognized the danger yet. The war dragged on for 3 years. Republic forces won victories, but could not break the momentum of Revan's expansion. Jedi who had remained loyal to the Council found themselves forced to fight former comrades. Friends killed friends. Masters faced fallen Padawans in lightsaber duels that left no winners, only survivors. The Order began to fracture under the strain. Some Jedi advocated for more aggressive tactics, arguing that the dark side could be used temporarily in service of a greater good. Others retreated into meditation and philosophy, seeking answers in ancient texts while the galaxy burned around them. And then, unexpectedly, the tide turned. Republic forces managed to ambush Revan's flagship during a routine patrol. In the desperate battle that followed, Darth Malak saw an opportunity. He ordered his own ships to fire on the command deck where Revan stood. Better to eliminate a rival and claim leadership than risk continued subordination. The attack nearly succeeded. Revan was captured by the Jedi strike team that boarded the crippled flagship, his body broken and his mind barely clinging to consciousness. The Jedi Council faced an impossible decision: execute a war criminal or attempt redemption for a fallen hero. They chose a third option. Using techniques from the most ancient holocrons, they erased Revan's memories, wiped away the Dark Lord and reconstructed the Jedi underneath. It was a violation of everything the Order claimed to stand for, but desperation breeds compromise. They gave Revan a new identity, a fabricated past, and sent him on a journey that would eventually lead him back to his true self. The gamble worked better than anyone dared hope. Revan, believing himself a simple Republic soldier, stumbled onto clues about his former life. The Jedi assigned to watch him guided his rediscovery carefully, hoping that experiencing his fall through fresh eyes might lead to genuine redemption rather than repetition. And slowly, painfully, Revan began to understand what he had become and what he had lost. Meanwhile, Darth Malak claimed control of the Sith forces and continued the war with even greater brutality. Without Revan's strategic restraint, the conflict evolved into simple destruction. Malak cared nothing for rebuilding. He wanted only to prove himself stronger than his former master by accomplishing what Revan had failed to achieve: total conquest. The final confrontation came in 3956, before Yavin aboard the Starforge, an ancient Rakatan superweapon that Revan had discovered and claimed during his initial fall. Revan, now redeemed and fighting for the Republic he had once tried to conquer, faced Malak in a duel that would determine the galaxy's fate. The battle raged through the Starforge's halls as the massive space station tore itself apart around them. In the end, Revan's renewed connection to the light side proved stronger than Malak's rage. The apprentice fell. The war ended, and the Republic, battered but intact, began the long process of rebuilding. But victory came with profound costs that few outside the Jedi Council understood. Thousands of Jedi had died. Entire lineages of knowledge were lost when temples burned, and the Jedi who survived carried scars that meditation could not heal. They had fought a war against their own, killed people they had trained beside, watched their philosophy of peace twisted into an engine of conquest. The Order would never fully recover from that betrayal. On Coruscant, one Jedi felt those costs more deeply than most. Chrysia had watched from the shadows as her students marched to war. She had said nothing when Revan left to fight the Mandalorians. She had remained silent when he fell to the dark side. She had done nothing while the galaxy tore itself apart because of teachings she had passed down. And the weight of that inaction crushed her spirit more thoroughly than any external punishment could have achieved. When Revan departed for the unknown regions after the war, seeking answers about the true Sith Empire he had discovered during his fall, Chrysia returned to the Jedi Council. She came bearing truth, an accounting of her failures, an explanation of how her lessons in questioning authority and thinking independently had been perverted into justification for atrocity. She expected judgment. She received something worse. The Council did judge her, but not for the reasons she anticipated. They blamed her directly for Revan's fall. Claimed her teachings had planted seeds of darkness that only needed time to sprout. They accused her of arrogance, of believing she could improve on millennia of Jedi tradition through intellectual innovation. She had encouraged students to question when obedience was required. She had taught philosophy when simple faith would have sufficed, and the result was visible in the smoking ruins of a dozen worlds. Master Vruk spoke the words of exile with barely concealed contempt. Master Itris, younger but equally certain, declared that Chrysia's methods had proven themselves false through their consequences. Others nodded agreement. The decision was unanimous. Chrysia was cast out from the Order, stripped of her rank, forbidden from teaching, sent away as if erasing her presence might somehow undo the damage her ideas had caused. She left without argument, walked out of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant and into a galaxy that no longer had a place for her. And as she wandered the Outer Rim, sleeping in cheap hostels and traveling on cargo ships that asked no questions, something fundamental broke inside her. Not her spirit, exactly. Breaking implies there was weakness. What happened to Chrysia was more like dissolution. A structure carefully built over decades, simply losing the will to maintain its cohesion. Every principle she had believed was revealed as naive. The Jedi claimed to serve the Force, but they were dogmatic and inflexible. They preached wisdom, but refused to question their own assumptions. The Sith pursued strength through passion, yet they destroyed themselves through infighting and excess. Both philosophies were prisons, different architectures, but equally confining, and the Force itself, that mystical energy field both sides revered, seemed nothing more than a cosmic tyrant, manipulating lives, forcing destinies, denying true choice to any who came within its grasp. The betrayal she felt was not merely personal, it was philosophical. Everything she had devoted her life to studying had been revealed as shallow, inadequate, false. And if the foundations of her understanding were wrong, then what remained? What purpose could she serve? What truth could she pursue? Months passed. She drifted from world to world without direction or goal, and then, inevitably, she felt the pull, a whisper at the edge of her consciousness. A place calling to her with the promise of answers she had not known to seek. The Force itself seemed to be guiding her, though by then she had begun to hate that guidance with an intensity that surprised her. Malachor v. the Wound, the place where Revan had fallen and millions had died, the planet that had broken the galaxy and might hold the key to understanding why. Chrysia booked passage on a smuggler's ship and did not tell them the destination until they were already in hyperspace. The crew complained but took her credits. They dropped her at the edge of the system and departed with engines straining, eager to put distance between themselves and that cursed world. She descended to the surface alone. The storms raged, the ruins waited, and deep in the Traeus Academy, ancient holocrons sensed her approach. They had been waiting a long time for someone like her. Someone who asked the right questions, someone willing to hear answers that would destroy everything she thought she knew. Chrysia walked into the darkness, and what she found there would transform her into something the galaxy had never seen before. Not a Jedi, not a Sith, something far more dangerous. A philosopher who had learned to hate the Force itself. The Trius Academy had been waiting for centuries. Abandoned after the fall of the ancient Sith Empire, its halls had seen no living presence for generations. But abandonment does not mean emptiness. The structure itself remembered. Stone held echoes of conversations spoken millennia ago. Meditation chambers retained impressions of the dark side philosophies once practiced within their walls, and in the deepest vaults, sealed away from time and decay, the holocrons preserved knowledge that the Jedi believed had been lost forever. Cryxia descended into those depths with the methodical patience of a scholar approaching forbidden texts. She did not rush, did not hesitate. Each step carried her further from the person she had been, and closer to something she could not yet name. The architecture itself seemed designed to facilitate transformation. Corridors spiraled downward in patterns that defied practical purpose, creating a sense of descent that was both physical and psychological. By the time she reached the central meditation chamber, she felt as if she had traveled not meters but light years from her former life. The holocrons activated at her approach. Ancient technology responding to Force sensitivity, projecting images of long-dead Sith philosophers into the dusty air. But these were not the raging conquerors or power-hungry tyrants that dominated popular understanding of the Sith. These were thinkers, scholars who had pursued dark-side knowledge, not for personal gain, but for understanding itself. They spoke of the Force not as an ally to be courted or an enemy to be resisted, but as a fundamental problem requiring a radical solution. One holocron in particular captured her attention. Its gatekeeper appeared as an elderly human woman, her features suggesting wisdom rather than malevolence. She spoke of the Force as chains, invisible bonds that restricted true freedom by imposing destiny on every living being. Jedi and Sith alike were puppets dancing to its manipulation. Both philosophies claimed to offer enlightenment, yet both demanded submission to the Force's will. The light side through selfless service, the dark side through passionate surrender, different paths leading to the same prison. Cryxia spent weeks in those chambers, reading, listening, absorbing philosophies that the Jedi Council would have declared heretical and the Sith would have dismissed as weakness. She began to see patterns her previous understanding had missed entirely. The cyclical nature of galactic conflict, light rising, then falling, dark ascending, then collapsing, over and over through millennia, as if the Force itself was conducting some cosmic experiment with living beings as its test subjects. Free will appeared to exist, but examination revealed it as illusory. Choices made by individuals inevitably led to predetermined outcomes. Destiny was just another word for cosmic tyranny. The wound in the Force called to her constantly. That rupture created at Malachor V, still fresh and bleeding in metaphysical terms, represented something unprecedented. A place where the Force's control had been broken, where its manipulation ceased to function. Cryxia stood at the edge of that void, and felt not horror but fascination. This was possibility. This was proof that the Force could be resisted, damaged, perhaps even destroyed. An idea began to form, radical beyond anything attempted in recorded history. Not to conquer the galaxy through Sith power, not to save it through Jedi righteousness. Both approaches accepted the Force's dominance as inevitable. What if someone rejected that assumption entirely? What if the goal was not to win the eternal conflict between light and dark, but to end the game itself? To kill the Force? The enormity of that ambition should have seemed insane. The Force connected all living things. It was the fabric of reality itself. In some fundamental sense, destroying it might unmake existence as completely as any superweapon. But Cryxia had spent her life studying the most dangerous questions philosophy could pose. She understood that some ideas were worth pursuing precisely because they terrified everyone else, and she had nothing left to lose. The Jedi had cast her out. Her students had fallen or been scattered. The galaxy she had tried to serve had proven itself unworthy of the service. What remained except the pursuit of ultimate truth, regardless of where that pursuit might lead? She took the title Darth Treya, Lord of Betrayal. The name was not chosen for intimidation or grandeur. It was simply accurate. She had betrayed the Jedi by questioning their dogma. She would betray the Sith by refusing to embrace their passion. And ultimately, she would betray the Force itself by seeking its annihilation. Betrayal was not her weakness, it was her philosophy made manifest. The rejection of all imposed loyalties in favor of something closer to genuine freedom. The Trias Academy became her base of operations. She restored power to sections that had lain dormant for centuries, cleared debris from training halls, activated ancient teaching devices that could instruct students in techniques the modern galaxy had forgotten. The facility was vast enough to house dozens of students if she could find individuals worthy of the knowledge she intended to pass down. But worthiness was the challenge. Most Force sensitives fell into predictable categories. Those who sought power for domination, those who craved peace through submission. She needed something rarer. Individuals capable of understanding that both light and dark were traps, and that true strength lay in rejecting the entire paradigm. She began to search, carefully, subtly, reaching out through the Force despite her growing hatred of it, seeking minds that questioned rather than accepted. The galaxy was full of Force sensitives, overlooked by both Jedi and Sith. Too old for traditional training, too cynical for conventional philosophy, too damaged by experience to embrace simple certainties. These were the students she cultivated, teaching them not to love the Force, but to understand its manipulation, not to surrender to destiny, but to recognize it as the enemy. Her philosophy evolved through teaching. The act of explaining ideas to others forced her to refine them, to defend them against questions she had not considered. She developed a methodology that borrowed techniques from both Jedi and Sith, but remained loyal to neither tradition. Students learned lightsaber combat because violence was sometimes necessary, not because martial prowess had inherent value. They studied Force powers because understanding the enemy required engaging with its tools, but always the lesson remained the same. The Force is chains. Both submission and domination are forms of slavery. Only through ultimate knowledge could one hope to achieve genuine independence. The dark side flowed through Malachor Vul like water through a broken dam. Students immersed in that environment absorbed its influence whether they intended to or not. Chrysia watched carefully, evaluating each individual's response to corruption. Those who embraced darkness too enthusiastically revealed themselves as potential Sith, still trapped in the cycle of passion and power. Those who resisted too strongly showed Jedi tendencies, reflexively falling back on light side conditioning. She needed students who could walk between both extremes without losing themselves to either, individuals strong enough to use the Force without being used by it in return. Years passed. The Trias Academy slowly filled with an unusual collection of Force users who defied conventional categorization. They were not Jedi. They were not Sith. They were something the galaxy had not seen before. Philosophers trained in violence. Warriors who questioned the purpose of their strength, and at their center stood Treya, no longer the exiled Jedi Master, but something far more dangerous. A teacher who instructed her students in the fine art of betraying everything they had been taught to revere. But teaching required more than philosophy and technique. It required examples. Living demonstrations of the principles she espoused. She needed apprentices who could embody different aspects of her vision, who could prove that alternatives to Jedi and Sith orthodoxy were not merely theoretical but achievable. And for that, she needed individuals who had already been broken by the galaxy, whose suffering had stripped away comfortable illusions, whose pain had taught them truths that the fortunate could never comprehend. She began to search for two specific types of students. The first was someone whose body had been destroyed, but whose will refused to accept death. Someone who understood that reality was mutable, that physical laws could be bent through sheer refusal to submit. The second was someone who had become a wound themselves, who embodied the very thing she sought to study and perhaps weaponize. Someone who consumed rather than connected, who represented the forces opposite made flesh. Finding such individuals would not be easy, but Triya had nothing except time, and she had learned that patience, combined with careful manipulation, could achieve results that raw power never could. She would find her weapons, she would forge them into instruments of her will, and together they would pursue the most ambitious goal any Force user had ever conceived. The end of the Force itself, and with it, the end of destiny's tyranny over the living galaxy. Pain has a voice. Not metaphorical discomfort or philosophical suffering, but genuine physical agony, the kind that overwrites thought, that reduces existence to a single screaming moment stretched across hours. Sishan had heard that voice for so long that he could no longer remember silence. Before his transformation, he had been a Jedi. The records disagree on his original name, suggesting he either hid it deliberately or that the pain eventually erased memories of who he had been. What is known is that he fought in the Mandalorian Wars, not under Revan's banner, but earlier, during the initial invasions when the Republic still believed conventional forces might be sufficient. He saw cities burn, watched civilians executed for the entertainment of Mandalorian shock troopers, felt the light side flicker and die in places where atrocity had become routine. The Jedi Council eventually deployed him as part of a reconnaissance team investigating Mandalorian supply lines in the Outer Rim. His ship was ambushed, his companions killed, and Sion himself was captured by a Mandalorian torture specialist who viewed pain as art form. 3 weeks he endured interrogation. Bones broken methodically, organs damaged with surgical precision. The Mandalorians wanted information about Republic fleet movements, but they also wanted to break a Jedi, to prove that even warriors with mystical powers could be reduced to begging animals if sufficient creativity was applied. Sion did not break. The Jedi training held even when his body failed. He retreated into the Force, using it to separate consciousness from physical sensation, a technique taught for meditation, but repurposed for survival. Pain became something happening to his body rather than to his self. He could observe it clinically, analyze it, almost appreciate its intensity in an abstract way. The Mandalorians grew frustrated, escalated their methods, pushed him to thresholds medical science insisted should result in death or madness. He survived through hatred, not the philosophical dark side embrace of anger, but something more primal, a refusal to give his captors the satisfaction of his destruction. Every time unconsciousness threatened, he would focus on that hate, let it anchor him, pull him back from the edge of death through sheer stubborn malice. The Force responded to that intensity, flooded his system with energies that should not have been accessible to someone in his condition. Dark side power that he was too desperate to reject and too determined to care about philosophical consequences. The Mandalorians eventually grew bored and discarded him, left his broken body on a remote asteroid, where Republic patrols occasionally passed. They assumed he would die within hours without medical intervention. Instead, he survived for 3 days before a smuggler's ship picked up his distress beacon. The crew took one look at his injuries and assumed they were transporting a corpse. But corpses do not breathe, even shallowly, and corpses certainly do not speak, even in whispers. Sion was transferred to a Republic medical facility specializing in catastrophic trauma. Doctors examined his condition with growing disbelief. 70% of his bones showed fractures. His internal organs were damaged beyond conventional repair. Neural scarring indicated torture that should have left him catatonic. Yet he remained conscious, responsive, insisting he would walk again despite every medical assessment indicating such recovery was impossible. They rebuilt what they could. Cybernetics replaced organs too damaged to function. Bone reconstruction surgery fused fractures using techniques that would leave him with permanent pain from nerve damage. The physicians did remarkable work, but they could not restore what he had been. The man who left that facility 3 months later moved with a shuffle, flinched at sudden movements, required medication for agony that never fully subsided. The Jedi Council offered sympathy and a position teaching younglings something safe, peaceful, appropriate for a warrior whose body could no longer handle combat. Sion declined with barely concealed contempt. They had sent him to war. They had failed to extract him when captured. They had been nowhere during the weeks of torture, and now they offered him a retirement posting while the galaxy still burned and Jedi still died. Their compassion was just another betrayal in a series that had begun the moment they chose political considerations over their own people's safety. He disappeared into the Outer Rim, seeking something he could not articulate, but recognized immediately when he encountered it. A rumor of a place on Malachor V, a facility where knowledge forbidden by both Jedi and Sith was being taught, where someone was training Force users in techniques that transcended traditional boundaries. It took him months to locate the Traius Academy. By the time he arrived, his body had deteriorated further. The cybernetics were failing. The bone reconstruction was coming apart under stress it had never been designed to handle. He was dying by centimeters, and he hated every moment of consciousness with an intensity that burned brighter than any pain. Triya found him collapsed in one of the Academy's outer corridors. She did not offer sympathy or assistance. She simply observed, studied him the way a scientist might examine an interesting specimen, asked questions about his condition with clinical detachment. How long had he been sustaining himself through hatred? Was he aware that he should have died weeks ago? Did he understand what he had become? Sion did not understand. He only knew that giving up felt impossible. Death should have been a release, but accepting it felt like surrender, and surrender was the one thing his mind absolutely refused to consider. Triya explained what she saw. His body was a ruin. Yes, but his will had become something extraordinary. Through constant application of dark side energy, he was literally refusing to allow his physical form to fail. Every moment of consciousness was an act of defiance against biology itself. He had discovered through desperation and hatred a technique the ancient Sith had pursued but rarely mastered: the ability to deny death through pure force of conviction. She offered him a choice: die here in her corridors as a testament to stubborn persistence, or accept her as a teacher and learn to transform agony into power. Use the pain that consumed him as a weapon. Become not just a survivor of torture, but its master. Embrace what he had become, rather than fighting against it. Let hatred sustain him, not accidentally but deliberately. Make the thing that should have destroyed him into the foundation of his strength. Sion accepted, not because he believed in her philosophy or trusted her intentions, but because the alternative was death, and death remained unacceptable. The training was brutal. Triya pushed him past every threshold he believed he had already exceeded, forced him to function despite injuries that left him screaming, taught him to channel that agony directly into force techniques that turned pain into offensive capability. Each day meant discovering new limits and then shattering them. Each night meant collapsing into something resembling sleep but was more like temporary unconsciousness born of exhaustion. Slowly, impossibly, he grew stronger, not healthier. His body continued deteriorating, but his control over the dark side energies sustaining him became more refined, more efficient. He learned to heal injuries just enough to prevent death, then let them remain partially damaged because the pain they generated fueled his power. Bones that had been broken would calcify improperly, creating constant ache. Nerve damage that physicians would have treated became a source of dark side strength. He was building himself into a paradox, a corpse that refused to acknowledge its death, a ruin that walked and fought and killed with efficiency that defied physical possibility. Trier named him Darth Sion, Lord of Pain. The title was not metaphorical. He had become pain itself. Every movement hurt, every breath hurt. Simply existing was agony, but that agony had been weaponized, transformed from a limitation into his greatest asset. Opponents who injured him only made him stronger. Death in combat was impossible because he refused to acknowledge it as an option. He could be cut down, dismembered, burned, and he would simply reassemble himself through hatred and dark side channeling. Kill him 10 times, and he would rise 11. Destroy his body completely, and his will would hold the pieces together long enough to strike back. He became Treyarch's first true weapon. Not a student learning philosophy, but an instrument of pure destruction barely restrained by her commands. She deployed him against targets that required overwhelming violence, sent him to eliminate threats that conventional assassins could not handle, and Sion fulfilled those missions with mechanical efficiency. He did not enjoy the killing, did not revel in combat. He simply executed Treyarch's will because serving her gave his suffering purpose. Without that purpose, pain was just torture. With it, pain became meaning. Over time, something else developed, an attachment to Sion himself, barely recognized for what it was. Trier was the only being who looked at his ruined form without pity or disgust. She saw him as useful, valuable, essential to her plans. That recognition, cold and pragmatic as it was, filled a void that 3 decades of Jedi compassion had never addressed. He began to crave her approval, not for philosophical reasons, but emotional ones. Loved her, in the twisted way that someone capable only of hatred could love. Needed her acknowledgement, the way living beings need air. Trier recognized that attachment and did not discourage it. She understood that Shuren's devotion made him controllable, that his need for her validation could be manipulated to ensure absolute loyalty. It was a tool like any other, and she had learned long ago that sentiment, properly exploited, was one of the most reliable levers for controlling otherwise unpredictable individuals. Sion became the guardian of the Treyarch Academy, standing watch while Trier taught, eliminating intruders who discovered the facility's location, training other students in combat techniques that emphasized endurance over skill. He was no longer human in any conventional sense. He was suffering made manifest, death denied, hatred given form and purpose, and he would remain that way, immortal through agony, for as long as his will held and Trier needed him. The galaxy would learn to fear the Lord of Pain, but that education was still years away. First, Trier needed her second weapon, something even more dangerous than a warrior who could not die. She needed hunger that could never be satisfied. She needed to find Nihilus. The colony world died on a Tuesday afternoon. Local time, one moment, 3,000 colonists were going about ordinary lives, farming, teaching children, repairing equipment. The next moment, they collapsed. Not dead from violence or disease, simply emptied, drained of the energy that animated their bodies, like someone had pulled a plug and let their life force drain away. By evening, the world was silent, except for wind moving through abandoned streets. Republic investigators arrived 2 weeks later, responding to missed communications. What they found defied explanation. Bodies preserved by the planet's cold climate showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of toxins, no indication of what had killed them. Medical examiners documented the deaths as simultaneous cardiac arrest affecting an entire population, which was scientifically impossible, but remained the only conclusion supported by evidence. The file was marked unexplained and eventually archived after follow-up investigations revealed nothing useful. 3 months later, another colony went silent. Larger this time, 12,000 people, same inexplicable mass casualty. Then a trading station with 20,000 inhabitants. Then an agricultural world with 500,000. The pattern emerged slowly because the affected locations were scattered across the outer rim, where communication was intermittent and oversight minimal. By the time Republic authorities recognized they were dealing with a serial phenomenon rather than isolated incidents, the death toll had exceeded 2 million. Someone or something was killing entire populations, not through conventional warfare or biological weapons. Through a method that left no physical evidence except the empty shells of those who had been alive moments before. Force-sensitive investigators reported disturbing findings from the affected worlds. The Force felt absent in those places, not blocked or suppressed, simply gone, as if the metaphysical energy that should have permeated all living things had been excised from the area entirely. The being responsible appeared only in fragmentary reports from the few locations where evacuation had been partially successful. Survivors spoke of a figure in dark robes approaching their world, a ship entering orbit that registered on sensors as wrong somehow. Not mechanically damaged, but fundamentally incorrect in ways they struggled to articulate. And then the hunger came. An overwhelming pull that yanked the life from their bodies. People who managed to board evacuation ships before succumbing described the sensation as drowning in emptiness, being pulled into a void that consumed everything about them that mattered. Trier heard about the killings and immediately understood what they represented. This was not a Sith Lord pursuing conquest. This was the wound from Malachor V made manifest in humanoid form. Someone who had either been present during the mass shadow generator's activation or had been created by that catastrophe. A living void. Hunger without consciousness or constraint. Something that consumed the Force itself, rather than merely channeling it. Finding such a being would be challenging. Tracking someone who left no survivors and could apparently appear anywhere without warning required patience and careful analysis of patterns others had missed. Trier studied the affected locations, searching for commonalities. The worlds targeted were all relatively isolated. All had populations large enough to provide substantial amounts of life energy, but small enough to avoid attention from major Republic forces. The consumption was escalating, each feeding slightly larger than the last, as if the being responsible needed more and more to achieve the same effect. She predicted where the next attack would occur, and traveled there ahead of time. A mining colony of 70,000 workers processing rare minerals from an asteroid field, remote enough that help was days away. Valuable enough that corporate interests maintained up-to-date communications. Perfect bait. Trier established herself in the colony's administrative sector and waited. The ship arrived exactly when her calculations suggested a Republic cruiser heavily damaged based on its emissions signature. The kind of vessel that might request assistance or sanctuary. The mining colony's traffic controllers granted landing clearance, likely assuming they were dealing with combat survivors. Within 30 minutes of the ship touching down, people began dying. Trier felt the hunger before she saw its source. A pull on her connection to the Force so intense it felt like physical pressure against her mind. The being was trying to feed on her, drain her life energy the way it had consumed billions already. But Trier had spent years studying the wound on Malachor V. She understood its nature, recognized the technique being employed, and she had prepared defenses specifically against this kind of assault. She severed her connection to the Force temporarily, not permanently like the exile had done, but a deliberate suspension of the link that made her vulnerable to consumption, rendered herself invisible to the hunger by making herself unappetizing. And then she approached the source of the devastation with careful, measured steps. The being stood in the colony's central plaza. Bodies lay collapsed in concentric circles around him, their arrangement suggesting they had fallen while trying to flee. He wore robes so dark they seemed to absorb light. A mask covered his face, not decorative armor, but something essential, as if whatever lay beneath required containment, lest it dissolve entirely. His presence in the Force was not merely dark, it was absent, a hole where a living being should register. Looking at him was like staring into the wound itself. Trier spoke, though she suspected the being might not comprehend language anymore. She identified herself, explained that she understood what he was, offered not sympathy, but recognition. He was hunger, eternal and insatiable, consuming the Force wherever he encountered it, because consumption was his nature. Fighting that hunger was pointless, resisting it impossible, but perhaps he could learn control, direction, use the terrible gift that Malachor V had given him for purposes beyond mere feeding. The being that would become Nihilus did not respond verbally. Perhaps he could no longer form words. Perhaps language had been one of the things consumed when he transformed. But Trier felt acknowledgement, recognition that something was communicating with him without immediately being devoured, and curiosity. The faintest trace of an emotion beyond hunger, interest in the concept that he might be more than an endless appetite wearing humanoid form. She led him back to Malachor Veth, to the Traeus Academy, where the wound itself could sustain him without requiring constant feeding on populated worlds, taught him slowly and with immense caution to extend time between consumptions, to draw energy from the dark side, saturating the planet rather than from living beings. It was never truly satisfying. Like drinking water when starving for solid food, but it was enough to grant him periods of something resembling stability. The training took years. Nihilus had to relearn concepts that should have been instinctive. Restraint, control. The difference between feeding because he needed to and feeding because life was present. Trier approached the work as one might domesticate a predator, not trying to eliminate his nature, but to channel it, make him useful rather than simply destructive. She named him Darth Nihilus, Lord of Hunger. The mask he wore was more than simple concealment. It was a binding, a focal point that helped anchor his dissolving spirit to something resembling physical form. Without it, she suspected he would dissipate entirely, become a spatial phenomenon rather than a being. The mask gave him identity, purpose beyond consumption, a reason to maintain coherence. His ship, the Ravager, was another tool for managing his nature. A Republic cruiser he had commandeered during one of his early feedings, it was kept operational entirely through his will. The vessel should have been scrapped decades ago. Systems failing, hull compromised, crew long dead. But Nihilus sustained it through the same dark side channeling that sustained his own body. The ship became an extension of himself, a mobile base from which he could hunt when Trier required it. She deployed him carefully, sent him only against targets that deserved annihilation. Sith strongholds that might threaten her plans. Jedi enclaves that needed to be eliminated without possibility of survivors. Nihilus became her ultimate weapon, the threat she could deploy when conventional force was insufficient. Entire fleets would turn and flee at word that his ship approached. Worlds would evacuate at reports of his presence in nearby systems. But control was always tentative. Nihilus was not truly loyal, could not be, because loyalty required comprehension of abstract concepts like duty and gratitude. He followed Trier's direction because she fed him, pointed him at targets rich with force energy. made his hunger marginally more bearable through the dark side knowledge she shared. But if that arrangement ever ceased being beneficial, he would consume her as easily as he consumed anyone else. She understood that danger, and accepted it. Power always came with risk. The key was ensuring the risk was manageable. With Cyan and Nihilus as her weapons, Traya possessed something unprecedented, a warrior who could not die, and a void that consumed everything it touched. One represented persistence through suffering. The other represented annihilation through hunger. Together they embodied aspects of her philosophy made manifest: rejection of conventional limitations, transformation of weakness into strength, and the willingness to embrace monstrous methods in pursuit of radical goals. The Sith Triumvirate was not yet formally established, but its foundations were in place. 3 individuals, united not by friendship or shared ambition, but by mutual utility. Traya the philosopher seeking to end the Force, Siren the immortal sustained by hatred and devotion, Nihilus the void driven by endless hunger. They would reshape the galaxy before their story concluded, leave scars that millennia might not fully heal. But first, they needed to perfect their methods, build their power base, and most importantly, eliminate the Jedi Order, not through conventional conquest, but through systematic annihilation. A purge so complete that future generations would struggle to believe the Order had ever existed. The Great Hunt was about to begin. The year 3955. Before Yavin marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Dark Wars, though that sanitized term barely captures the systematic horror that unfolded. 3 individuals who should never have existed, let alone cooperated, united under a shared purpose that would nearly erase the Jedi Order from galactic memory. Traya established the formal structure of their alliance with characteristic pragmatism. She would serve as the architect, the mind that identified targets, planned operations, and maintained the strategic vision guiding their campaign. Cyan would function as the hunter, leading ground forces, pursuing individual Jedi through the ruins and hideouts where they sought refuge. Nihilus would be the terror weapon, the nightmare deployed against concentrations of Force users too large for conventional assault. Their division of labor reflected their natures perfectly. Traya thought, Cyan endured, Nihilus consumed. Together they represented something the galaxy had never faced. Not a Sith empire built on conquest and hierarchy, but a decentralized network of destruction, operating with surgical precision. They did not seek territory, they sought annihilation, the complete eradication of an organization that had existed for 25,000 years. The Traya's Academy reached its apex during this period. Students who had absorbed Traya's teachings graduated to become Sith assassins. These were not the theatrical warriors of ancient Sith tradition. They wore no elaborate armor or carried distinctive weapons. They blended into crowds, posed as merchants, bureaucrats, even Republic soldiers. Their training emphasized subtlety over spectacle. A Sith assassin could enter a cantina, identify the Jedi drinking alone in a corner booth, eliminate them with techniques that mimicked natural causes, and depart before anyone noticed something amiss. Traya developed specialized methods for hunting Force sensitives. Traditional Sith relied on sensing their opponents through the Force itself, but Jedi could mask their presence if sufficiently trained. Her assassins learned to identify behavioral patterns instead. The way Jedi moved with unconscious grace, their tendency to intervene in conflicts even when logic suggested avoiding involvement, the subtle tells that betrayed years of lightsaber training. Psychology became as important as Force sensitivity. Understanding how Jedi thought allowed prediction of where they would hide and who they would contact. The campaign began with isolated strikes. A Jedi historian murdered in the Coruscant archives. A master meditating on Dantooine found dead in her quarters. A Padawan traveling to rejoin his teacher, never arriving at the destination. Each death appeared random, unfortunate. the kind of tragedy that occurs in a galaxy where violence is commonplace. The Jedi Council noticed the pattern only after dozens had died, and by then momentum had shifted decisively against them. Tria's strategy relied on creating cascading failures. Jedi operated through networks of trust and communication. Masters trained Padawans, who became knights, who trained their own students. Lineages stretching back centuries connected thousands of Force users across the galaxy. Sever those connections systematically, and the entire structure collapses. Kill the Masters, and the Padawans become lost. Eliminate the Archivists, and knowledge disappears. Target the Council members and leadership fragments. It was genocide disguised as asymmetric warfare. Tumen excelled at his role with grim efficiency. He led strike teams against Jedi enclaves that had declared themselves neutral during the recent wars. These were communities of healers, teachers, agricultural specialists who had never raised lightsabers in anger. They died anyway. Tumen did not distinguish between combatants and civilians, between those who fought in wars and those who tended gardens. If they connected to the Force, they were targets. If they provided sanctuary to other Jedi, they were accomplices. His logic was merciless and his execution was thorough. The physical nature of his immortality proved devastating in combat. Jedi who thought they had won would watch in horror as Sion's corpse reassembled itself. Limbs severed would reattach through dark side channeling. Mortal wounds would close slowly while he continued fighting. Some Jedi broke psychologically before dying, unable to process the impossibility of their opponent's endurance. Others fought until exhaustion claimed them, expending every ounce of strength against an enemy who could not tire, because pain was his fuel rather than his limitation. But Nihilus represented true existential dread. Tria deployed him sparingly because his power was difficult to control and impossible to conceal. When she learned of Jedi gatherings, attempts by survivors to coordinate resistance or simply find comfort in community, she would send Nihilus. His ship would appear in orbit, and the dying would begin. Not combat, not battle, simply consumption. Katar became the most infamous example of his capability. A colony world inhabited primarily by Miraluka, a near-human species born without eyes, who perceived reality through Force sight. Their culture had produced numerous Jedi over millennia. When the Purge began, Katar became a refuge. Masters traveled there, seeking safety in numbers. The theory was sound. No conventional force could overcome dozens of trained Jedi fighting together. Sith assassins would be detected and eliminated. Even Sassan's immortality had limits when faced with sufficient opposition. They did not account for Nihilus. He arrived alone aboard the Ravager. The ship entered orbit and simply remained there, hovering above the planet like a dark moon, and then the feeding began. Witnesses from nearby systems reported seeing Katar's lights go dark. Not gradually as power systems failed, but instantly, as if every living being maintaining those cities had simultaneously ceased to exist. Ships attempting to investigate found themselves caught in the effect. Crew members collapsed at their stations. Automated systems saved some vessels by jumping to hyperspace before everyone aboard died. Those who survived spoke of overwhelming emptiness, a pull on their life force so intense that resisting felt like trying to swim against a riptide. When Republic investigators finally reached Katar weeks later, they found a dead world, not destroyed, not burned, simply empty. 300,000 Maraluka colonists gone. 47 Jedi Masters and their Padawans vanished without trace. Buildings stood intact but abandoned. Gardens grew wild without tenders. The planet remained habitable in every technical sense, except that nothing lived there anymore. Even microorganisms in the soil had been consumed. Katar became a memorial and a warning, proof that the threat facing the Jedi transcended conventional danger. One survivor emerged from that catastrophe. A young Miraluka woman named Vizus Ma, who had been strong in the Force but not trained as a Jedi. Nihilus spared her, not from mercy, but from calculated utility. He needed an apprentice, someone who could speak when he could not, navigate social situations that required communication beyond raw power. Visus Ma became his voice and his servant, bound to him through trauma and dark side conditioning that rewrote her personality at fundamental levels. The Jedi Council's response to these attacks was fragmented and ineffective. Masters who had spent decades debating philosophy found themselves ill-equipped for guerrilla warfare against opponents who operated outside conventional rules of engagement. Attempts to gather forces for coordinated defense only created targets for Nihilus. Efforts to hide individually left Jedi isolated and vulnerable to Sith assassins. Every strategic option they considered had been anticipated and countered. Some council members advocated for aggressive retaliation, hunt the Sith before they hunted you, strike at the Trius Academy directly with overwhelming force. But locating Malachor Vive proved difficult. The planet existed in records, but its precise coordinates had been classified after the mass shadow generator incident. Those who did know the location were either dead or in hiding, and even if an assault force reached the Academy, what then? Nihilus alone could annihilate a fleet. Sion could slaughter armies. Traya was the one who had trained them, and presumably possessed defenses that made direct assault suicidal. Other council members urged dispersion, abandon the traditional temple structures and enclaves that made Jedi easy to find, go underground, preserve knowledge in hidden archives, focus on survival rather than resistance. This faction argued that the Order had weathered dark periods before. Patience and endurance would allow them to rebuild when the current threat passed. The Sith always eventually destroyed themselves through infighting and excess. The debate paralyzed decision-making at the highest levels precisely when unity of purpose was most critical. Individual masters made their own choices. Some gathered their Padawans and fled to the unknown regions. Others decided to fight, organizing small resistance cells. A few chose to hide their force sensitivity entirely, abandoning lightsabers and techniques that might reveal their nature. The Jedi Order fractured into dozens of disconnected groups pursuing incompatible strategies. Atris, a senior council member, established a secret academy on Telos Polar region. She collected Jedi artifacts and holocrons, hoarding knowledge against the possibility of total destruction. Her facility was hidden beneath ice sheets thick enough to shield against most detection methods. She populated it with carefully selected students who showed potential but would not be missed if the academy was discovered. It was preservation through paranoia, and it worked precisely because Atris trusted no one enough to compromise operational security. Master Zez-Kai-El fled to Nar Shaddaa, the smuggler's moon orbiting Nal Hutta, a world so saturated with criminal activity that one more fugitive barely registered. He disguised himself as a refugee maintenance worker, abandoned his lightsaber, lived in squalor among beings who would never imagine the broken old man fixing their plumbing had once been a prominent Jedi philosopher. Survival required total anonymity and the willingness to ignore injustices he would once have corrected without hesitation. Other masters made similar compromises, hid among populations large enough to mask their presence, worked menial jobs that kept them fed but demanded no attention, watched as the galaxy descended into chaos without the Jedi peacekeepers who had maintained order for millennia. It was survival purchased at the cost of everything their philosophy claimed to value. But death served no one. Living meant hope for eventual restoration. Dying meant victory for those who sought the Order's extinction. The Republic itself proved incapable of effective response. Politicians issued condemnations and promised investigations that led nowhere. Military forces trained to fight conventional wars struggled against enemies who operated in shadows and left no survivors to interrogate. Planetary governments requested Jedi protection that no longer existed. Trade routes became dangerous as pirates realized enforcement had collapsed. Systems on the Outer Rim considered secession when it became clear Coruscant could no longer project meaningful authority. In temple meditation chambers across the galaxy, silence replaced the constant background hum of Force activity. Places that had resonated with light side energy for centuries went dark, not corrupted by the dark side, but simply empty, as if the Force itself was withdrawing from locations saturated with death. Younglings who should have been training in those facilities were scattered or dead. Holocrons that should have been teaching future generations sat forgotten in vaults being systematically looted by Sith assassins. Trier watched the destruction unfold with satisfaction tempered by impatience. The Jedi were dying, yes, but they were dying too slowly. Survivors meant potential resurgence. Knowledge preserved meant eventual reconstruction. She needed complete annihilation. A purge so thorough that future historians would struggle to believe the Order had ever existed. Only then could she pursue her ultimate goal. Only when the last Jedi died could she focus on killing the Force itself. The galaxy bled. The Force screamed with the deaths of thousands who had dedicated their lives to serving it. And three lords fed on that suffering. Sion through the pain of endless combat. Nihilus through direct consumption of life energy. Trier through the satisfaction of watching her philosophy proven correct. The Jedi had been weak, dogmatic, slaves to the Force they claimed to serve. Now they were paying the price for that weakness. But even as the Purge approached its terrible zenith, fissures began appearing in the Triumvirate itself. Synergen's devotion to Trier grew increasingly obsessive. Nihilus's hunger became harder to control, and Trier's ultimate goal remained hidden, even from her closest allies. Betrayal was not just her title, it was her inevitable destiny. The monsters she had created would soon turn on their maker, and the galaxy would discover that some betrayals echo louder than any victory. Understanding requires context that Sion and Nihilus had never fully grasped. Terea had never intended to simply rule the galaxy through Sith power. Conquest was a tool. Destruction of the Jedi was a necessary first step, but her ambition transcended political control or military dominance. She sought something far more radical, something that would make every previous Sith Lord's goal seem modest by comparison. She intended to murder the Force itself. The concept was not metaphorical. Trier had spent years studying the wound on Malachor Vere, understanding how mass death could damage the Force in measurable ways, create spaces where its influence weakened or ceased entirely. The Mass Shadow Generator had proven that sufficient violence could tear reality's fabric. If one weapon could create one wound, could 1,000 weapons create a galaxy-wide rupture? Could the Force be starved through systematic elimination of Force-sensitive beings, made irrelevant through destruction of those who channeled it? Her philosophy had evolved from questioning the Force to actively opposing it. She viewed it as the ultimate tyrant, an energy field that manipulated every living being toward predetermined outcomes. Jedi and Sith alike were puppets dancing to its tune. Free will was illusion. Choice was theater performed for an audience of one. The Force moved people like pieces on a game board, and resistance was futile because resistance itself was part of the pattern it imposed. Unless someone could break the pattern entirely, end the game by destroying the board, kill the Force, and finally truly allow beings to make genuine choices uninfluenced by mystical manipulation. She had kept this goal hidden from Sion and Nihilus for obvious reasons. Revealing it prematurely would invite their resistance. Sion was sustained entirely by dark side energy. Without the Force, he would die instantly. Nihilus was even more dependent. He was not a being who used the Force. He was Force consumption given semi-human form. Killing the Force meant killing him by definition. Neither would voluntarily support a plan that guaranteed their annihilation. Trier had always intended to use them, and then dispose of them, once their utility ended. They were weapons, tools she had forged for specific purposes. When those purposes were fulfilled, she would discard them without hesitation or regret. It was simply pragmatic. Ethical considerations did not apply to objects, and that was ultimately how she viewed both her apprentices, useful objects that happened to be ambulatory. But maintaining such deception required careful management. Sashin, in particular, was developing attachments she had encouraged, but now found inconvenient. His devotion had made him controllable, yes, but devotion came with expectations. He anticipated reward for service, sought approval beyond simple acknowledgement of competence, wanted something approaching genuine connection in whatever twisted form his psychology could conceptualize. She had manipulated him expertly for years, offered just enough positive reinforcement to maintain loyalty while withholding enough to keep him perpetually seeking more. Standard psychological conditioning applied to an unusual subject. But as the purge neared completion, Sion's need for validation had intensified. He asked questions about their ultimate goals, wanted confirmation that his suffering served purposes beyond mere destruction, needed to believe his existence meant something. Nihilus was harder to read, but no less dependent. He followed Trier because she directed him toward food, made his hunger marginally bearable through the knowledge she shared. But hunger was fundamentally insatiable. Each feeding required more to achieve the same satisfaction. The dark side energy saturating Malachor V no longer sustained him adequately. He needed regular consumption of living force users to maintain stability, and the supply of such prey was dwindling as the purge succeeded. The conversation that precipitated the betrayal occurred on Malachor V in the Treyas Academy's central meditation chamber. Treya had summoned both apprentices to discuss the campaign's next phase. The Jedi were scattered but not extinct. Final operations would require coordination and commitment of their full resources. She needed their agreement to proceed, and in seeking that agreement, she made a calculated error. She told them the truth, not the complete truth. She was too skilled a manipulator for such crude honesty, but enough truth that they understood the end game. The ultimate goal was not Sith dominance, not the replacement of Jedi philosophy with dark side teachings, not even revenge for past grievances. The goal was the Force's complete annihilation, the end of light and dark as meaningful concepts. The death of the energy field that sustained civilizations across millions of worlds. Sion understood the implication immediately. His mind was not sophisticated, but it grasped essentials quickly. If the Force died, he died with it. Everything he had endured, every moment of agony, he had transformed into strength. Every victory he had won, through refusing death, all of it would mean nothing if Treyarch's plan succeeded. She was not offering him immortality. She was offering him eventual guaranteed execution after he had served her purposes. Nihilus's reaction was less cognitive, but more visceral. He did not reason through implications, he felt them. The Force was not something he used, it was what he consumed. It was food and purpose, and the only thing preventing his complete dissolution. Trier was proposing to starve him permanently, to remove the one thing sustaining his existence. Whether he understood her reasoning was irrelevant. He understood threat, and his response to threats was simple. Consume them before they consumed you. Trier recognized her mistake within seconds, but had no time to correct it. She had anticipated resistance eventually, planned for the possibility of conflict with her apprentices, but she had expected that conflict to occur after the Jedi were extinct, after her power base was secure enough that she could eliminate both apprentices simultaneously. Instead, she had united them against her prematurely, given them common cause when they should have remained focused on external enemies. The attack came without warning. Sion moved first. His lightsaber ignited and struck before Trier finished speaking. Not the careful, measured combat of a duel, but the desperate assault of someone fighting for existence itself. Nihilus followed a heartbeat later, not with a lightsaber, but with his consumption technique, attempting to drain Tria's force connection before she could mount effective defense. She fought brilliantly, decades of knowledge and skill channeled into techniques neither apprentice had seen before. Lightsaber forms that flowed between offensive and defensive without pause. Force powers that manipulated reality in ways that defied conventional understanding. She was not merely defending herself. She was teaching a final lesson, demonstrating that intelligence and preparation could overcome raw power if applied correctly. But she was one against two, and these were not ordinary opponents. The Scion could not be killed through conventional methods. Each injury she inflicted healed within seconds. Each time she thought she had gained advantage, he would rise again. Nihilus was worse. His consumption technique bypassed physical defenses entirely, attacked her force connection directly. She had to maintain constant vigilance against that drain, while simultaneously fighting Scion. No one could sustain such divided focus indefinitely. The battle raged through the Trias Academy, destroying meditation chambers and training halls. Students and assassins fled the complex as the structure itself began collapsing from the energies being unleashed. Traya gave ground slowly, retreating through corridors she knew better than her apprentices, setting traps, using environmental advantages, fighting with the desperation of someone who understood that defeat meant permanent erasure of everything she had worked to achieve. In the deepest levels of the academy, in chambers carved from Malachor V's bedrock, the final confrontation occurred. Traya had prepared contingencies, artifacts that might shift the balance, knowledge that could give her edge against overwhelming physical advantage. But preparation requires time to implement, and time was exactly what her apprentices denied her. Nihilus managed a feeding that connected fully, drained a substantial portion of her force reserves in a single terrible moment. Traya felt her connection to the force weakening, the power that had sustained her for decades flowing out like blood from a severed artery. She tried to counter, but Scion was there, his blade finding gaps in her defense that exhaustion created, not killing strikes. He did not want her dead. Traya had taught him too well. He knew that death could be preferable to alternative fates. They stripped her force connection entirely, not severing it as the exile had done, but having Nihilus consume it, drinking her power until she was nothing more than a mundane human, elderly, weakened, vulnerable in ways she had not experienced since childhood. The force that had been her foundation for 80 years simply vanished, left her hollow and diminished. A philosopher who had spent her life studying the mystical suddenly cut off from it completely. Scion stood over her broken form with emotions he could not articulate, triumph mixed with grief, satisfaction at surviving contaminated by loss of the one being whose acknowledgement had mattered. He had won, proved himself stronger than his master, as Sith tradition demanded. But winning meant killing the only connection he had valued, the only relationship that had given his suffering meaning beyond endurance. He did not deliver the killing blow. Perhaps he could not bring himself to do it. Perhaps he believed letting her live as a powerless ruin was crueler than death. He and Nihilus simply left her there in the depths of the academy, abandoned her to whatever fate awaited someone stripped of everything that had defined them. They ascended to the surface and departed Malachor Viv without looking back. Traya lay in darkness for hours, possibly days. Time became meaningless when measured only by pain and humiliation. Her body was broken from the battle, her spirit crushed by betrayal that she of all people should have anticipated. She had named herself Lord of Betrayal, and yet had been blindsided by the very thing her title warned against. The irony was not lost on her even through the agony. Eventually she moved, crawled through corridors until she found chambers where automated systems still functioned. medical equipment that could stabilize her injuries, food synthesizers that provided basic sustenance. She survived through the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had characterized her entire philosophy. Dying would prove her apprentices right, would validate their decision to eliminate her. She would not give them that satisfaction. Her connection to the Force was gone, but her mind remained sharp. If anything, the loss clarified her thinking, removed distractions that mystical power had provided. She could not manipulate reality through the Force any longer, but she could still manipulate people, and she still possessed knowledge that made her dangerous, even powerless. Plans within plans, contingencies she had prepared precisely because she understood that power was temporary, but ideas were eternal. She shed the title Darth Traya, returned to being simply Chrysia, a name from before the fall, before the transformation, a reminder of what she had been and what she might become again through different means. And she began to plan, not for immediate revenge. That was Sith thinking. Emotional and short-sighted, she would plan for something far more sophisticated, a strategy that would turn her apprentices' betrayal into the weapon that destroyed them. But she needed an instrument, someone strong in the Force but not corrupted by conventional Jedi or Sith thinking, someone who understood loss and betrayal from personal experience. Someone who could be guided toward the destiny Traya envisioned without realizing they were being manipulated until too late. She needed the exile, Mitra Surik, the woman who had activated the mass shadow generator and severed her Force connection, the living wound who represented everything Traya's philosophy required. If she could find the exile, guide her properly, then perhaps the betrayal could be transformed from defeat into eventual victory. The Triumvirate was broken, but the purge would continue. Sion and Nisus had taken control of the Sith operations and would drive them forward with brutal efficiency. Let them hunt the last Jedi. Eliminate every master and Padawan who might resist. Their success would only make Traya's eventual victory more complete. Because when the exile finally emerged from her self-imposed exile in the unknown regions, when she returned to a galaxy where the Jedi were nearly extinct and the Sith ruled through terror, Traya would be waiting, not as an enemy, as a guide, a teacher, the one person who truly understood what the exile had become and what she represented. And through the exile, Traya would achieve her revenge and pursue her ultimate goal. The death of the Force, the end of destiny, the liberation of every living being from the chains they did not even know they wore. The betrayal was not the end of her story. It was merely another chapter, and Chrysia had always been better at writing endings than beginnings. Power divided often proves more dangerous than power concentrated. The Sith Triumvirate had functioned as a coordinated entity precisely because Traya imposed strategic coherence on their operations. With her gone, Sion and Nihilus divided the galaxy between themselves according to their natures and capabilities. The result was not cooperation but parallel campaigns of destruction that occasionally reinforced each other through coincidence rather than planning. Sion claimed dominion over ground operations and conventional warfare. His forces consisted of the Sith assassins trained at the Trayus Academy and military units that had pledged allegiance to the Triumvirate during its ascent. These were not the massive armies of ancient Sith empires, but smaller, more mobile strike forces optimized for hunting specific targets. Elite troops who excelled at the kind of asymmetric warfare that made conventional military doctrine obsolete. His campaigns followed a pattern refined through years of practice. Intelligence gathering identified Jedi locations. Sith assassins infiltrated target populations to verify information and establish surveillance. Then Sion himself would arrive with shock troops to eliminate the threat before escape was possible. He did not bother with elaborate strategies or sophisticated tactics. His approach was direct application of overwhelming violence. Arrive faster than expected, strike harder than anticipated. Accept no surrender, leave no survivors. The horror of fighting Cyan extended beyond his tactical efficiency. It was the psychological impact of facing an opponent who could not be permanently harmed. Jedi who managed to cut him down would watch in despair as his corpse reassembled. Defenders who thought they had won when he collapsed would discover that victory was temporary. Hope itself became weaponized against them. Every apparent success revealed as illusion. Every moment of relief transformed into renewed terror when he rose again. Some Jedi broke mentally before dying, unable to process the impossibility of their situation, unable to maintain composure when faced with evidence that their understanding of reality was fundamentally incomplete. These were not weak individuals. They were trained Force users who had faced death countless times. But there was something uniquely devastating about fighting an enemy whose existence violated natural law, about dying to someone who represented death denied. Cyan's personal motivation remained opaque even to those who served him. He rarely spoke, issued orders through subordinates rather than direct communication, seemed to derive no satisfaction from victory or feel frustration at setbacks. He simply continued, hunting Jedi because that was the purpose he had been given, because Triya had directed him toward this task before her fall, because altering course would require initiative he either did not possess or deliberately refused to exercise. But beneath that mechanical efficiency, something festered. Grief, perhaps, or the closest approximation of grief someone like Sekn could experience. He had betrayed Triya to survive, made the pragmatic choice when presented with impossible options. Yet pragmatism did not eliminate emotional consequences. He had destroyed the one being whose recognition mattered, eliminated the only relationship that had given his suffering meaning beyond simple endurance. Winning that battle felt increasingly like the worst defeat of his existence. He compensated through escalation. More aggressive tactics, shorter intervals between operations, accepting missions that offered minimal strategic value simply to remain occupied. Anything to avoid the silence that came when campaigns ended. The quiet moments when he might reflect on what he had done and what he had lost. Pain could be weaponized, endured, transformed into strength. But grief offered no such conversion. It simply sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable, and utterly pointless. Nihilus operated on a completely different scale. He had no interest in ground combat or conventional military operations. His approach was simpler and infinitely more terrifying. He hunted concentrations of Force-sensitive life and consumed them, not individuals, not even groups. Entire populations. His ship would appear in orbit above a world and the feeding would begin. The Ravager itself inspired dread among spacers and military personnel familiar with its reputation. A vessel that should have been scrapped decades ago maintained through sheer dark-side will. Its hull showed catastrophic damage never repaired. Entire sections were exposed to vacuum. Yet it flew, not smoothly or efficiently, but it moved through space and hyperspace as if conventional physics were optional suggestions rather than absolute laws. Visas Ma served as Nephilus's voice and intermediary. She coordinated with local Sith forces when necessary, delivered his intentions to those who needed direction, handled the mundane logistics of maintaining terror operations across multiple sectors. But she was more than a servant. The trauma of Qatar's destruction and subsequent conditioning had broken her in ways that conventional therapy could never repair. She existed in constant awareness of Nephilus's presence, felt his hunger as if it were her own, lived in perpetual anticipation of the moment when he might decide she was food rather than tool. Her psychological state provided insight into what Nihilus represented. He was not evil in any conventional sense. Evil requires intentionality, requires choosing harm when alternatives exist. Nihilus had no choice. He was hunger. Asking him not to feed was like asking fire not to burn. meaningless. His nature was consumption, and restraint only meant slightly longer intervals between catastrophes. He could no more stop feeding than living beings could stop breathing. The worlds he targeted shared certain characteristics, isolated enough that help would arrive too late, populated with enough force sensitives to make consumption worthwhile, strategically irrelevant enough that their destruction did not trigger overwhelming Republic response. He was not trying to conquer territory or eliminate military assets. He was simply feeding. The political and social consequences were incidental to his actual purpose. After Qatar, other colonies fell with grim regularity. A Jedi agricultural collective on Dantooine's southern continent vanished overnight. 3,000 people reduced to empty husks in buildings that otherwise remained untouched. A Republic research station studying Force phenomena near the deep core. Crew of 1,200 scientists and support staff drained so thoroughly that even the laboratory animals died. Their experiments on force crystallization interrupted mid-procedure, equipment still running when rescue vessels arrived weeks later. Each feeding left a specific signature that Republic investigators learned to recognize, not physical evidence. Metaphysical absence. The force simply stopped existing in affected areas, not weakened or corrupted, but erased, as if reality had been edited to remove that particular component. Force-sensitive investigators who entered these zones reported profound disorientation. The constant background awareness of life energy that they relied on unconsciously simply vanished, like suddenly going deaf or blind. A sense removed that they had not realized they depended on until it disappeared. The Jedi Order's response continued to fragment under sustained pressure. No unified strategy emerged, because no unified leadership remained. Masters who attempted to organize resistance found themselves targeted by Sith assassins before coordination could be established. Communications were compromised. Trust eroded. Every message might be intercepted. Every ally might be an infiltrator. Paranoia became survival necessity. The Master Kavar retreated to Onderon, where he had political connections through Queen Talia. He served as her advisor, while hiding his Jedi identity from most of the population. Even close confidants knew him only as a military consultant with expertise in Force user tactics. He lived divided between public role and private reality, watching the galaxy fall apart while maintaining appearances of normality, contributing what he could while understanding that individual efforts meant nothing against the scale of destruction being unleashed. The exile remained absent through all of this, still wandering the unknown regions following Revan's trail, completely unaware that the galaxy she had left was collapsing into darkness, that the Jedi Order she had been exiled from was being systematically annihilated. Her isolation was both curse and strange blessing. She could not help because she did not know help was needed. But her absence also meant she was not targeted by the Purge, was not marked for elimination by Sith assassins hunting survivors. Republic military forces tried to adapt to threats they barely understood. Admirals accustomed to fleet actions against conventional opponents found themselves helpless against enemies who operated in shadows. How do you defend against assassins who look like ordinary citizens? How do you protect populations from a ship that kills through methods sensors cannot detect? Traditional doctrine offered no answers. New strategies had to be developed through trial and error meant death tolls that made senators demand accountability from military leaders who had no good explanations to offer. Some planetary governments attempted appeasement, declared their worlds free of Jedi and Force users, published lists of citizens with Force sensitivity and their current locations, hoped that cooperation might spare them from Sith attention. It never worked. Betraying your own brought nothing except temporary delay. Zion and Nihilus did not reward collaboration. They exploited weakness. Worlds that surrendered Force-sensitive citizens for execution simply demonstrated they would sacrifice anyone to survive, made themselves targets for different reasons. Other governments chose resistance, fortified population centers, deployed military assets to defend against potential Sith incursions, established emergency evacuation protocols for Force-sensitive refugees. These worlds fared somewhat better, not because they could defeat Triumvirate forces, but because open defiance suggested strength. Predators generally prefer weak prey over strong, easier targets existed. Why expend resources conquering a fortified world when undefended colonies offered equivalent Force-sensitive populations? The Republic Senate remained paralyzed by internal conflicts. Representatives from core worlds demanded action without offering resources or political support necessary to take that action. Senators from Outer Rim sectors argued that the Purge was not their problem, that their constituencies had never relied on Jedi protection, and saw no reason to sacrifice soldiers defending an organization that most citizens barely understood. Budget battles consumed time that should have been spent on strategic planning. Committees formed to study the problem without implementing solutions. Chancellor Cressa, elected during more peaceful times, proved completely inadequate to the crisis. She had built her career on consensus building and diplomatic compromise, skills that worked beautifully when problems were manageable, disagreements between rational actors, useless when facing enemies who wanted complete annihilation rather than negotiated settlement. Her speeches were eloquent, and her intentions genuine, but intentions achieved nothing against opponents who viewed compassion as exploitable weakness. In hidden enclaves across the galaxy, the last Jedi watched civilization fray. They maintained what traditions they could, trained Padawans in secrecy, preserved knowledge against the possibility of rebuilding someday. But hope was difficult to sustain when every news report brought evidence of further collapse. When the Republic that had been their partner for millennia proved incapable of protecting its own citizens. When even the Force itself seemed to be withdrawing from the galaxy under assault. Ratrice, secure in her hidden academy on Tellus, began to question whether preservation was even worthwhile. She had collected artifacts and holocrons, safeguarded the accumulated wisdom of 100 generations of Jedi. But to what purpose, if no one remained to learn from it? Knowledge without inheritors was just data. Meaningless information stored against a future that might never arrive. She found herself drawn toward the Sith holocrons in her collection, studying dark side techniques, not from academic interest, but from growing belief that fighting darkness required understanding it, using it. The corruption was subtle. She never consciously decided to fall, never had a moment where she chose evil over good, but small compromises accumulated, justifications that made sense when examined individually, but revealed a terrible pattern when viewed collectively. She began to hate the Jedi who had fled or hidden rather than fighting, blamed them for the Order's collapse, saw their weakness as betrayal, and in blaming others she avoided examining her own choices, her own descent into exactly the kind of thinking that created Sith Lords from fallen Jedi. Across the galaxy, similar stories played out in different contexts. Jedi who survived did so by compromising something essential, their principles, their compassion, their connection to the Force. The Order was dying not just through murder, but through moral erosion. Each survivor had to choose which parts of their identity to sacrifice, and those choices changed them fundamentally, made them something other than what they had been. Even victory, if it came, would be hollow. Restoration would be building something new rather than recovering what was lost. The Force itself seemed diminished, as if mass death and pervasive suffering had weakened it somehow. Or perhaps that was projection. The trauma of those who remained coloring their perception of metaphysical reality. Jedi had always taught that the Force reflected life across the galaxy. If life was dying on such massive scale, would the Force weaken correspondingly, or was it eternal, regardless of how many beings connected to it. Questions without answers, philosophy pursued while hiding in ruins. Scion and Nihilus continued their parallel campaigns, not cooperating, not communicating beyond operational necessity, just destroying everything in their paths. Two lords of annihilation who had betrayed their master and now pursued her vision without understanding its ultimate purpose. They thought they had won, claimed leadership of the Sith and control over galactic darkside operations. But winning meant nothing if the victory was empty, if survival came at the cost of purpose. In the depths of the Traeus Academy, Chrysia waited, planned, prepared for the moment when the exile would return, and the final game could begin. She was patient. She had always been patient, and she understood that the best revenges were those that enemies facilitated themselves. Sarian and Nihilus were doing her work, eliminating the Jedi, creating the conditions necessary for her ultimate goal. They thought they had escaped her manipulation through betrayal. They did not understand that betrayal itself had been part of the plan all along. The galaxy was burning, but fire cleansed as well as destroyed, and from the ashes something new might eventually emerge. Something free from the tyranny of the Force, something that chose its own destiny rather than having destiny imposed. That was the promise Chrysia offered, the vision she pursued, even powerless and broken, and she would see it fulfilled regardless of what it cost, regardless of who had to die. The reign of terror was far from over, but its end was approaching, and endings, Chrysia knew, were when philosophy became most important, when the difference between victory and defeat was determined not by strength, but by understanding. She was the betrayer. She had been betrayed. And soon, everyone would learn that in her hands, betrayal was not weakness. It was the sharpest weapon of all. The Ebon Hawk emerged from hyperspace above Paragus in the year 3951, before Yavin Mitra Surik had been gone for 5 years, wandering the unknown regions on a fool's quest to find Revan, following breadcrumbs that led nowhere, chasing rumors of a returned Dark Lord who was either saving the galaxy from some hidden threat or had simply vanished into the void. She never found him, never got answers to questions that had haunted her since Malachor Vir. What she found instead was a galaxy that had continued without her, changed in ways she could barely recognize. The Republic was diminished, the Jedi were gone, and something was hunting Force users with methodical precision. Paragus mining facility was her first indication that returning had been a mistake. The station was dying when she arrived. Sabotaged, overrun by mining droids gone homicidal, the few survivors spoke of a woman who had arrived before her, an old woman who asked questions and left bodies in her wake. Kreia, though Surik did not know that name yet. She woke from Kolto treatment to find the old woman standing over her, watching with eyes that seemed to catalogue every weakness, every vulnerability. Chrysia introduced herself as a teacher, claimed she could help Surik reconnect with the Force she had severed at Malachor V. The offer was suspicious, the timing too convenient, but Surik was adrift, lost, and drowning people grasp at anything that might keep them afloat. Paragus exploded before they could escape cleanly. Fuel tanks ignited by the chaos Chrysia had orchestrated. The mining facility tore itself apart in a series of detonations that could be seen from orbit. Surik piloted the Ebon Hawk through debris fields and past Republic warships that arrived too late. Chrysia sat calmly in the co-pilot seat, offering guidance, asking questions that seemed innocent but probed at foundations Surik had never examined. Their first real conversation happened in hyperspace between Paragus and Telis. Chrysia explained the galaxy's current state with clinical detachment. The Jedi Order had been systematically destroyed, thousands dead, survivors in hiding. 2 Sith Lords hunting the remnants, Saijan who could not die. Nephilus who consumed worlds. The Republic was collapsing under pressure it could not comprehend, and Surik was uniquely positioned to stop it because of what she had become at Malachor. A wound in the Force. Chrysia spoke the words with something approaching reverence. Surik had severed her connection to survive the mass shadow generator's psychic backlash, cut herself off from the screaming death of millions. But that severing had left her changed. She was not Force blind, she was something stranger. A void that could still sense the Force without being connected to it. Invisible to those who hunted through Force perception, immune to techniques that relied on draining or corrupting Force connections. Nihilus could not feed on her. Terra stated it as fact, rather than theory. The Lord of Hunger who consumed entire populations would find Surik indigestible. She was emptiness. And you cannot drain what is already hollow. This made her the perfect weapon against a threat the galaxy could not otherwise defeat. If Chrysia could guide her properly, train her to understand what she had become and how to weaponize it. Surik did not trust the old woman, but options were limited. She landed on Telos and immediately found herself entangled in the station's intrigues. Artris had established an academy there, hidden in the polar ice. The council member who had judged Surik most harshly at her trial now claimed to be preserving Jedi knowledge. But something was wrong. Surik could feel it even through her damaged Force connection, corruption masquerading as preservation. The reunion with Artris was bitter. The former council member accused Surik of cowardice, of fleeing to the unknown regions while the Order died. Never mind that Surik had been exiled, had been cast out, and forbidden to return. In Artris's narrative, every Jedi who had not died fighting was complicit in the Order's destruction, and Surik bore special guilt for Malachor V. For activating the weapon that had created the wound, that had enabled monsters like Nihilus to exist. Surik left Telos with more questions than answers. Chrysia guided her to Nar Shaddaa, where refugees and criminals operated beyond Republic authority. There she found Master Zez-Kai-El hiding as a maintenance worker, a council member reduced to fixing plumbing for beings who would kill him if they knew his identity. He spoke of the purge with defeated certainty, of watching the Order collapse from the safety of anonymity, of choosing survival over principle because dead Jedi helped no one. Each world revealed more of the catastrophe. Onderon, where Master Kava advised the Queen while pretending to be military consultant, Dantooine, where the Enclave had been destroyed and graves marked hundreds of fallen Jedi. Korriban, where Sith tombs held echoes of philosophies that made Chrysia's teaching seem almost reasonable. Everywhere Sisig traveled, she collected companions, broken people drawn to her, for reasons they could not articulate. Aton Rand, a former Sith assassin trying to outrun his past. Bao Dur, the engineer who had built the mass shadow generator and carried guilt for millions of deaths. Visas Mar, who appeared aboard the Ebon Hawk bearing a warning from her master. Nephilus knew of Surik now, sensed something wrong about her presence in the Force, and he was coming to investigate, to determine whether she was threat or prey. Chrysia orchestrated every encounter with invisible precision, placed Surik in situations that forced growth, that pushed her to reconnect with the Force not through conventional Jedi methods, but through bonds with living beings. Each companion represented a thread, a connection that bridged the gap between Surik's severed nature and the galaxy's metaphysical energy. She was learning to touch the Force again, but differently, through echoes and reflections rather than direct connection. The old woman's lessons were never what they seemed. Philosophy disguised as casual conversation, tests hidden in mundane decisions. Chrysia was teaching something that transcended Jedi and Sith traditions, a third path that rejected both light and dark as meaningful categories. Choice mattered. Action mattered. But the Force's judgment was irrelevant. Destiny was a lie told by those who wanted to control others. Real strength came from making decisions uninfluenced by mystical manipulation. Surik absorbed the teachings without fully understanding them. She was too focused on immediate threats, on gathering the surviving Jedi Masters, on preparing for inevitable confrontations with the Sith Lords hunting her. But Kraya's words lodged in her mind like seeds, waiting for conditions that would allow them to germinate. When Visas Ma arrived aboard the Ebon Hawk, violence erupted immediately. The Mirror-Looker attacked with techniques taught by Nihilus, attempting to drain Surik the way her master would. But the technique failed. Surik's wound negated it, turned the attack inward, so that Visas found herself vulnerable rather than threatening. The fight ended with the assassin kneeling, defeated not through superior skill, but through fundamental incompatibility of abilities. Visas pledged service to Surik, not from loyalty, but from recognition. She had spent years as Nihilus's servant, bound to him through trauma and conditioning. But Surik offered something Nihilus never could, the possibility of genuine connection, of bonds based on choice rather than domination. Visas did not fully break free of her master. His presence still echoed in her consciousness. But for the first time since Qatar's destruction, she felt hope that escape might be possible. The gathering of masters was Atris's idea. One final conclave where survivors could coordinate resistance, or at least bear witness to their order's end with dignity. Surik traveled between worlds collecting them. Zez Kai El, Kavavrik, who had survived on Dantooine through paranoia and skill. They came reluctantly, traveling to Dantooine with the understanding that this might be their final meeting. That gathering meant creating a target for enemies who specialized in eliminating such gatherings. Their judgment of Surik was harsh. They blamed her for Malachor V, even though following Revan had been the right choice at the time. They questioned her nature as a wound, feared what she represented. Some argued for severing her from the Force permanently, making her completely mundane to eliminate the threat she might pose. Others wanted to study her, understand how someone could exist outside the Force's influence. Chrysia intervened with fury that shocked everyone present. She revealed truths the Masters had spent years avoiding, their cowardice during the Mandalorian Wars, their failure to act when action might have prevented catastrophe, their current state as broken remnants hiding while the galaxy burned. The Order had fallen not because of Surik, but because the Jedi themselves had become weak, dogmatic, unable to adapt when adaptation was survival. The confrontation exposed fractures that had existed for years. Vrug maintained traditional positions with increasing desperation. Kavar acknowledged failures but could not articulate alternatives. Zez-Kai El simply seemed exhausted, tired of fighting, tired of hiding, ready for whatever end approached. They were not a council anymore, just survivors arguing about philosophies that felt increasingly irrelevant. And then Nihilus arrived. His ship appeared in orbit. The Ravager, dead vessel kept mobile. Through dark side will, the feeding began immediately. Dantooine's few remaining inhabitants collapsed. The Masters felt the pull, recognized what was happening, understood that gathering had indeed made them targets, but understanding changed nothing. They could not fight what was coming, could only prepare to die with whatever dignity remained. Surik felt the pull differently, not as drain but as invitation. Nihilus was calling to her specifically, sensing her wound, wanting to understand what she was, whether she was kin or enemy. The message was clear. Come to me, face me, or everyone on this world dies while you watch helplessly. She went, took Visas and whoever else volunteered, boarded the Ebon Hawk and flew toward the Ravager, toward confrontation with hunger made manifest, toward the first of 3 battles that would determine whether the galaxy survived or succumbed to darkness. Chrysia watched her go with satisfaction. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The weapon was ready, the targets were exposed, and soon, very soon, the final lessons could begin. The betrayer would be betrayed again, but this time, the outcome would be different. This time, Chrysia would ensure it. The Ravager hung in space like a wound, torn hull exposing internal decks to vacuum, entire sections missing, as if reality had decided the ship did not deserve to exist completely, yet it flew, moved through space with the steady inevitability of a predator tracking prey. Nihilus had sustained it through will alone for years, made it part of himself, an extension of his hunger given physical form. Boarding was chaos. Republic forces had attempted to storm the vessel once. Their frozen corpses still floated in corridors, testimony to what happened when conventional tactics met unconventional threats. Surik led her team through those halls, stepping over bodies that had died screaming, past bulkheads torn open by forces that had nothing to do with weapons. The ship itself seemed aware of their presence, hostile in ways that defied mechanical explanation. Nihilus waited in what had once been the command bridge, his mask turned toward them as they entered. That terrible artifact that bound his dissolving spirit to something resembling physical form. Visas stood beside Surik, trembling. This was her master, the being who had saved and damned her, who had given her purpose through domination. Facing him meant confronting every trauma she had spent years trying to suppress. He spoke, not words exactly, a sound that bypassed ears and resonated directly in consciousness, asking questions that had no linguistic equivalent. What are you? Why do you not feed me? Are you empty or full? Surik did not answer because she did not need to. Her existence was answer enough. She was the wound. The thing that should not be possible, existence without force connection. Life that provided no sustenance. The battle was inevitable. Nihilus attacked not from anger, but from confusion. She did not make sense. Violated his understanding of reality, and what confused him, he tried to consume. His technique was the same one that had killed billions, the drain that pulled life force directly from living beings. It should have worked. Should have reduced Surik to an empty husk in seconds. Instead, it backfired, turned inward. The void tried to consume emptiness and found itself consuming its own technique. Nihilus staggered. His mask tilted as if seeing Surik for the first time, understanding dawning that she was not prey. She was predator, a different kind of hunger that fed on force consumption itself. Visas moved then. Years of training allowed her to recognize vulnerability. She struck not with hatred, but with desperate hope, severing the bonds that had connected her to Nicias for so long, choosing Surik over her master, choosing freedom even though freedom terrified her more than servitude ever had. Her blade found gaps in Nicias' defenses, forced him to divide attention between two opponents when managing even one was proving impossible. Surik closed distance. Her lightsaber found the mask, that anchor point holding dissolution at bay. She struck, and the mask shattered, pieces falling away to reveal what lay beneath. Nothing. Literal emptiness. Nihilus had consumed so completely for so long that nothing remained of whatever he had been, just void wearing a shape, hunger that had finally run out of things to devour. He collapsed, not dying, because dying implied having been alive, simply stopping. The dark side energy sustaining him dispersed. The Ravager began tearing itself apart without his will to hold it together. Bulkheads groaned. Atmosphere vented. The ship was finally acknowledging that it should have been destroyed years ago. They fled, ran through corridors, disintegrating behind them, reached the Ebon Hawk seconds before the Ravager's reactor breached. The explosion was visible from the surface. A new star briefly illuminating Talos' orbit. Then nothing. Nihilus was gone. The hunger that had consumed worlds finally starved. But two remained. Malachor V called to Surik with inevitable gravity. She knew the destination before Chrysia suggested it. The wound recognized its birthplace. The place where millions had died and something terrible had been born. Where the Triumvirate had formed. Where Trier had fallen and planned her revenge. Everything led back to that cursed planet. The approach was wrong immediately. Reality behaved strangely near Malachor V. Hyperspace transitions felt uncertain, as if the universe was not entirely sure the planet should exist. When they finally broke orbit, the surface appeared exactly as Surik remembered from 5 years ago. Black stone, red storms, ruins that predated recorded history. Nothing had changed, or everything had changed, and the physical appearance was just mask over deeper alterations. The Trias Academy waited in the deepest canyon, entrance still accessible, despite years of neglect. Surik descended with Chrysia beside her. The old woman was different now, more focused, as if proximity to this place restored something she had lost. They walked through halls where Sith philosophy had been refined into poison, where students had learned to hate the Force itself, where Trier had transformed from exiled Jedi into something far more dangerous. Sorian found them in the meditation chambers. He had been waiting, knowing eventually someone would come, that his service to Treyarch's vision would demand final accounting. He looked worse than reports suggested. A corpse held together through hatred and dark side channeling. Every movement produced sounds that should not come from living tissue. Bones grinding, flesh tearing and reforming. He was suffering made visible. The first battle was brutal. Cyan attacked with techniques perfected over decades. Every strike precise despite his ruined body. Every defense calculated. He was not merely warrior, he was martial philosophy given form. The understanding that victory came through endurance rather than skill, through refusing defeat even when defeat was deserved. Surik cut him down, severed limbs, struck killing blows. He rose every time, reassembled through will that transcended biological possibility. The fight continued for what felt like hours. Both combatants exhausted, both pushing past limits. But Surik had something Surian lacked. She had learned from Chrysia, understood that some battles were not won through force. She stopped fighting, lowered her weapon, spoke to him, not as enemy but as someone who understood suffering, asked if he was tired, if enduring was worth the cost, if hatred was adequate compensation for an existence defined entirely by pain. The questions were not attacks, they were offers. Permission to consider alternatives. Cyan struck her, drove his blade through her shoulder, not killing blow but vicious nonetheless. She did not retaliate, simply endured, asked again, "Are you tired? Do you want this to end?" Something broke in him, not physically. He had been physically broken for years, something deeper. The will that had sustained him through decades of agony, the conviction that endurance justified suffering. He had betrayed Trier to survive, made pragmatic choice when faced with extinction, but surviving meant continuing to exist as ruin, as monument to pain that should have killed him long ago. He had loved Trier, in his twisted fashion, loved her, and betrayed her. The contradiction had poisoned him more thoroughly than any wound. Victory had been defeat, survival had been death, and he was so tired, so unspeakably tired. He let go, simply released the hatred holding him together, allowed death that had been waiting patiently for decades to finally claim him. His body collapsed, this time permanently. No dark side resurrection. No stubborn refusal, just ending. Peace after immortality. Silence after endless screaming. The Lord of Pain finally granted the mercy he had never allowed himself. Surik moved deeper into the academy, to the Traeus core, where Kreia waited. No longer the frail old woman who had guided her across the galaxy. Darth Treya once more, restored somehow, power flowing through her again. She stood in the center of a meditation chamber carved from Malachor V's bedrock, 3 lightsabers orbiting her body, controlled through techniques Surik had never seen. Kreia explained everything. Then, the complete plan. She had orchestrated Surik's entire journey, manipulated every choice, placed her in situations designed to force growth, made her into weapons specifically crafted to destroy the Triumvirate. Sion and Nicelus had been tools, necessary for eliminating the Jedi, but ultimately disposable. Surik was the true instrument, the wound that could kill what conventional Force users could not touch. But the revelation went deeper. Kreia had not merely wanted revenge on her former apprentices, her goal transcended personal vendetta. She wanted to end the Force itself, use Surik's nature as wound to tear reality apart, create cascading failure that would spread across the galaxy, kill the mystical energy field that enslaved every living being to predetermined destiny. Malachor V would be epicenter. The mass shadow generator could be reactivated, used not to destroy fleets, but to create wounds so massive that the Force could not heal from it. Surik would be catalyst. Her damaged connection would amplify the effect, allow the wound to spread beyond Malachor V, eventually consume the entire galaxy, free every being from the Force's tyranny through its complete annihilation. The choice was Surik's. Activate the weapon, embrace what she had become, accept that destiny was chains and freedom required destruction, or reject the teaching. Refuse to believe the Force was enemy. Maintain faith in concepts Kreia had spent years proving false. Light and dark, good and evil, choice and consequence. All lies told by the Force to maintain control. The Surik rejected her, not from certainty, but from doubt. She did not know if Kreia was right, could not prove the Force was benevolent or neutral, but ending all life to free it from metaphysical influence felt wrong. Genocide disguised as liberation, philosophy taken to extremes that destroyed what it claimed to save. She had activated one superweapon, lived with the consequences. She would not activate another. The battle was unlike anything Surik had experienced. Kreia fought not to kill, but to teach. Every attack was lesson. Every defense was question. She wanted Surik to understand, not merely defeat her. The lightsabers orbiting her body struck from impossible angles, severed faster than Surik could block. Kreia was demonstrating what mastery looked like, what philosophy achieved when combined with absolute technical skill. But mastery has limitations. Kreia was old, weakened by years of suffering, and Surik had learned from the best teacher available. She had learned from Kreia herself, understood that some truths were worth pursuing even when they hurt, that questioning everything, including the questions themselves, was path to understanding. She used those lessons against their teacher. The fight ended with Kreia disarmed, her lightsabers scattered, her body failing from exertion. She looked at Surik with expression mixing pride and disappointment. Pride that her student had surpassed her, disappointment that surpassing meant rejection of the ultimate teaching. Kreia died as she lived, offering one final lesson. She had tested whether choice could exist outside the Force's influence, whether genuine free will was possible. Surik's decision to reject the plan was itself answer. Either she had chosen freely, proving Kreia wrong, or the Force had manipulated her into rejection, proving Kreia right. The ambiguity was perfect. Philosophical victory regardless of outcome. She asked Surik to destroy Malachor V, seal the wound rather than spread it. The planet was corruption manifest, would continue spawning darkness as long as it existed. Better to end it completely. Surik agreed. Not because Kriya commanded, but because the request made sense. Some places should not exist. Some knowledge should not be preserved. The mass shadow generator reactivated one final time, not to kill, but to destroy the planet itself. Malachor V tore apart under gravitational stress. Canyons collapsed. The academy crumbled. Storms that had raged for millennia finally dissipated. The wound began to heal as its source was eliminated. Reality stitched itself back together. Slowly, imperfectly, but healing nonetheless. Surik escaped seconds before complete destruction, watched from orbit as Malachor V became debris field, another scar on the galaxy. Another reminder of what ambition and philosophy could achieve when taken to extremes. She felt the wound in her own connection begin to close, not healed completely. She would always be damaged, but damaged was different from destroyed. She could live with damaged. The Sith Triumvirate was ended. 3 lords who had nearly destroyed the Jedi, who had reshaped the galaxy through hunger and pain and betrayal, gone, leaving only questions and consequences. The price of their ambition measured in millions of lives. The legacy they created written in trauma that would echo through generations. The galaxy did not heal overnight. Wounds this deep required decades, generations. Some would never fully close. The Jedi Order was functionally extinct. Fewer than 100 confirmed survivors across billions of worlds. An organization that had existed for 25,000 years reduced to scattered remnants who barely maintained contact. Rebuilding was possible, eventually, but the order that emerged would be fundamentally different from what had been lost. The Republic survived, but diminished. Entire sectors had declared independence during the chaos. Planetary governments that had relied on Jedi peacekeepers for millennia suddenly faced reality without that support. Some adapted, developed local security forces and judicial systems. Others collapsed into warlordism and corporate exploitation. The Senate continued debating, but its authority was theoretical in regions where enforcement had become impossible. Surik gathered the surviving Jedi for final accounting. Turix had fallen completely by then. Her hidden academy on Telos revealed as corrupted from inception. She had collected Sith holocrons obsessively, studied dark side techniques while telling herself it was research. The line between understanding evil and embracing it had dissolved without her noticing. She was enemy by the time Surik confronted her, had to be defeated rather than redeemed. Another casualty of the purge even though she survived physically. The handful of masters who remained made Surik the informal leader, not through official appointment but through recognition that she had done what they could not. Survived, adapted, overcome threats they had hidden from. She accepted reluctantly. Leadership meant responsibility, meant making decisions that would affect an organization barely clinging to existence. She had followed orders before, seen where obedience led when combined with flawed strategy. This time would be different, had to be different. Her first decision was controversial. She would leave, travel to the unknown regions seeking Revan. He had departed years ago, pursuing threats he believed endangered the galaxy. If those threats still existed, someone needed to address them before the Republic finished collapsing. And if Revan needed help, who better than someone who understood what he had become? The other Jedi protested, argued that she was needed for rebuilding, that abandoning the Order again when it was most vulnerable repeated the pattern that had caused so much destruction. But Surik understood something they did not. The Order's survival depended on adapting, breaking cycles that had defined Jedi thinking for millennia. Sometimes the most important thing was not being present, but addressing threats before they materialized. She departed quietly, took the Ebon Hawk and a handful of companions who chose to follow. disappeared into regions where maps became suggestions and hyperspace lanes existed more as theory than confirmed routes. Whether she found Revan remains disputed. Records from that period are incomplete. What is confirmed is that she never returned. The wound who had saved the galaxy vanished into darkness, seeking answers to questions most people did not know to ask. Behind her, the reconstruction began, not of what had been, but of what might be possible. The Jedi who remained were changed people. Survivors who had compromised principles to live, who had watched their order die, and questioned whether restoration was even desirable. They trained new students, but differently, with less certainty, more willingness to question tradition and adapt techniques to circumstances. The Trias Academy was destroyed, but its influence persisted. Ideas do not die with buildings. Krea's philosophy had spread through her students. Some had survived the Triumvirate's fall. They carried her teachings into different contexts, not as Sith, but as alternative force philosophy, questioning whether light and dark were meaningful categories, whether the Jedi Council's ancient wisdom was wisdom at all, or just accumulated dogma, whether true strength came from submission to the Force, or from understanding its manipulation. These questions would resurface across galactic history, never quite resolved. Each generation of Force users grappling with the same fundamental problems, the balance between power and restraint, between following one's heart and submitting to tradition, between individual choice and collective responsibility. Krycia had not won, but she had not entirely lost either. She had planted doubts that would grow for millennia. The wound in the Force at Malachor V's former location eventually healed. Decades passed before Force-sensitive beings could approach that region without discomfort. Centuries before the metaphysical scarring faded completely, but it healed. Reality proved more resilient than Krycia had believed. The Force was not tyrant that could be killed or wound that would spread uncontrollably. It was energy field. Neutral, responding to how living beings used it without imposing predetermined outcomes. Or perhaps that conclusion was itself Force manipulation, making survivors believe they had chosen freely when choice was illusion. The philosophical debate continued without resolution, because some questions have no answers, only competing perspectives maintained through faith. Individual lives moved forward into uncertain futures. Visas Mai found peace eventually. Years of meditation and gradual healing from trauma. She never forgot Qatar or Nihilus, but memory became teacher rather than tormentor. She helped establish a new Miraluka colony, trained young people in foresight techniques. Her culture had developed, lived quietly doing small good works that accumulated into meaningful contributions. Aton Rand sought redemption through service. He had been Sith assassin, killed Jedi for the Triumvirate. His conscience was not clean, and never would be, but he could choose better actions going forward, make decisions that honored victims he could not bring back. It was not absolution, but it was something, purpose beyond guilt, direction beyond shame. Van-O-Dur carried the mass shadow generator's legacy until his death. He had built the weapon that created the wound, had enabled Malachor V's catastrophe. No amount of subsequent good work erased that reality. He helped rebuild Tellers, designed systems that protected rather than destroyed, devoted his remaining years to engineering solutions for humanitarian crises. It was penance performed, knowing penance could never be adequate. The Sith teachings, scattered by the Triumvirate's fall, were never fully recovered. Holocrons and texts had been distributed across dozens of worlds. Some were found and destroyed. Others were hidden away in private collections. A few disappeared into archives, where they would wait centuries before being rediscovered. The knowledge was never entirely lost, just dormant, waiting for conditions that would allow it to flourish again. Darth Bane would eventually discover some of those teachings. 300 years later, he would study the Triumvirate's methods, and draw conclusions about Sith organization. The rule of two emerged partially from understanding what happened when too many Sith lords cooperated. Power divided was power weakened. Better to maintain strict hierarchy, master and apprentice. No more competition that eliminated weakness while avoiding the fragmentation that had destroyed previous Sith attempts at dominance. The Republic eventually stabilized. New institutions replaced those that had failed, systems developed for maintaining order without relying on Jedi intervention. It was not better necessarily, just different, more militarized, more willing to accept authoritarian solutions when threats emerged. The seeds of what would eventually become the Galactic Empire were planted during the reconstruction from the Purge. Fear of chaos, creating willingness to sacrifice freedom for security. The Force itself continued its eternal flow, light and dark rising and falling like tides. Individual beings connecting to it and using it according to their nature and choices. The wound had been an aberration, proof that the Force could be damaged, but also that it would heal. Reality was resilient, not invulnerable but resistant to permanent destruction. Even the Triumvirate's best efforts had ultimately failed to achieve lasting change. Or had they? The galaxy after the Purge was fundamentally different from the galaxy before. The Jedi's confidence was shattered, their assumption of moral authority questioned, the Republic's faith in its institutions undermined, millions dead who might have lived, entire civilizations traumatized, wounds that would scar even after healing. Sion had proven that suffering could be weaponized. That pain became strength if endured with sufficient conviction. Nephilis had demonstrated that hunger could consume worlds, that some Force techniques created beings that transcended conventional categories of life and death. Trier had shown that philosophy could be more dangerous than armies, that ideas killed more thoroughly than lightsabers when given time to spread. Their legacy was measured not in territory conquered or governments overthrown. It was measured in changes to how beings across the galaxy understood the Force and their relationship to it. Questions that had been settled became open again. Certainties that had guided civilizations for millennia revealed as assumptions rather than facts. The wound closed, the scars remained, and beings throughout the galaxy learned to live with the knowledge that sometimes survival meant embracing damage, that healing did not mean returning to what had been, that moving forward required accepting fundamental change rather than trying to restore past configurations. The Sith Triumvirate ended, but their story continued, echoing through history, influencing decisions made by beings who never knew their names, shaping conflicts that would erupt millennia after their deaths. Some wounds heal, some scars fade, but some changes are permanent, written into the galaxy's structure at levels too deep for conscious awareness. The Force remembered, even if individual beings forgot, and memory shaped futures in ways no one could fully predict or control. The storms over Malachor V's ruins finally quieted. Where a planet had once orbited, only debris remained, drifting through space in patterns that would take millennia to disperse completely. The wound that had birthed monsters was sealed. Reality stitched itself back together, slowly, imperfectly, but healing nonetheless. Across the galaxy, life continued, not unchanged, never unchanged after such catastrophe, but continuing. Tel'Ur's forests regrew where war had scarred the land. Dantooine's grasslands swayed under twin suns that had witnessed the Order's rise and fall. Coruscant's endless cityscape glittered with lights representing trillions of beings pursuing ordinary lives, unaware of how close they had come to annihilation, unaware of the price others paid for their survival. The Force flowed on, eternal and indifferent, light and dark rising and falling, like tides governed by moons only mystics could perceive. Each generation faced its own darkness, its own hunger and pain and betrayal. The faces changed, the names were forgotten, but the patterns repeated endlessly, because the galaxy was vast and time was infinite, and some lessons had to be relearned by each age. The Jedi rebuilt slowly, with humility born from near extinction. They were different now, less certain, more willing to question tradition, understanding that survival sometimes required adaptation rather than rigid adherence to ancient codes. The temples they constructed were smaller, hidden, not monuments to pride, but sanctuaries for learning, places where the mistakes of the past could be studied, so they might not be repeated. The Sith would rise again. They always did. Different forms, different philosophies, but the same fundamental hunger for power that had driven Traya and her apprentices. The cycle would continue. Light opposing dark. Dark consuming light. Balance achieved through eternal conflict, rather than lasting peace. It was the way of the Force, the way of the galaxy, perhaps the way of existence itself. On distant worlds whose names appear in no archives, beings trained in techniques the Triumvirate had developed, not Sith, not Jedi. Something between or beyond both. Individuals who had learned that the Force was tool rather than master, that philosophy mattered more than tradition, that true strength came from understanding rather than submission. Chrysia's legacy lived in them, quiet, unacknowledged, shaping futures she would never witness. Visas Ma stood on the cliffs of her new homeworld, watching stars emerge as the sun set. She had been blind her entire life, saw through the Force rather than conventional sight. But after Nihilus died, after the trauma began healing, she discovered she could perceive beauty in ways she never had before. The gentle pulse of life across her colony, the quiet contentment of beings no longer running from darkness. It was enough, more than enough. Aton found peace in service to others, small acts of kindness that could never balance the scales, but mattered nonetheless. He died old, surrounded by people who knew him only as the cranky mechanic who fixed their ships and told terrible jokes. They never learned he had been an assassin, never knew the blood on his hands. He was grateful for that mercy, the chance to be remembered for who he became, rather than who he had been. The exile never returned. Somewhere in the unknown regions she faced threats and challenges no record documents. Whether she found Revan remains unknown. Whether she succeeded in whatever mission drove her into darkness is disputed by historians. But she had made her choice, followed her path, accepted that some questions have no answers, and some journeys have no return. The galaxy turned, stars died, and were born. Civilizations rose and fell. The Force witnessed it all with patience that transcended mortal understanding. 3 lords of hunger and pain and betrayal had tried to break its dominion. They had failed, but their attempt mattered. Proved that beings could question destiny even knowing they might not change it. That philosophy and conviction could challenge cosmic order even temporarily. In meditation chambers across countless worlds, Jedi taught younglings about balance, about the dangers of attachment, and the necessity of compassion, about serving the Force while maintaining individual will. The lessons were ancient, the students were new, each generation hearing the same wisdom, each generation interpreting it through their own experience, each generation making the same mistakes and discovering the same truths their ancestors had found. The Force dreams, not consciously, not with intention, but it dreams nonetheless. And in those dreams, the galaxy finds its patterns, light opposing dark, creation balanced by destruction, life sustained through death. The Triumvirate had sought to end the dream, wake reality from mystical manipulation. They failed because the dream was reality, not illusion imposed from outside, but fundamental nature of existence itself. On Malachor V's former coordinates, ships occasionally passed. Sensors registered nothing unusual, just empty space where a planet had once orbited. But Force sensitives reported feeling echoes, distant whispers of the wound that had been, reminders that some scars never fully fade. That history leaves marks on reality deeper than conventional perception can detect. The story of the Sith Triumvirate became legend, then myth, then cautionary tale told to children. Details were lost, facts became embellished, the truth became obscured by centuries of retelling. But the essence remained. 3 beings who had become monsters, 3 lords who had nearly destroyed the order, 3 lives that proved suffering could be transformed into terrible strength, and 3 deaths that demonstrated all power was temporary. All ambition was finite. All hunger eventually ended through starvation or satisfaction or simple exhaustion. The Force flows on, through you, through me, through every being across the galaxy, connecting all things in patterns too vast for comprehension, light and dark, good and evil. These are labels applied by those who need categories, but the Force itself knows no such distinctions. It simply is eternal, indifferent, beautiful in its complexity, terrible in its power. And in that eternal flow, beings make choices, some wise, some foolish, some that seem insignificant but ripple across centuries. The Triumvirate chose hunger, chose pain, chose betrayal, and the galaxy learned from their choices, adapted, survived, continued. Tonight you rest knowing their story, understanding that darkness can be overcome, that wounds can heal, that even the deepest scars eventually fade into memory. The galaxy is vast, time is infinite, and in that vastness and infinity there is peace for those who seek it. The stars drift overhead, distant suns illuminating worlds you will never visit, beings living lives you will never know. The Force connects you to them all, binds the galaxy together in ways beyond understanding. But binding is not imprisonment. Connection is not chains. You are part of something larger, while remaining entirely yourself. Sleep now. Let the story settle in your mind. The Triumvirate's hunger ended. Their pain ceased. Their betrayals were answered with final rest. And the galaxy continues, forever turning, forever changing, forever finding balance between light and dark. Thank you for joining this journey into the past. If these stories help you rest, consider subscribing for more legends from that galaxy far away. More tales of those who shaped history through their choices. More chronicles of beings who faced darkness and either succumbed or overcame. The Force dreams on, and in its dreams, you find peace. The Triumvirate's tale is told, their legacy understood. And now, finally, there is only silence. The gentle quiet of stars drifting through endless night, the soft rhythm of your breathing, the calm that comes when stories end and rest begins. May the Force be with you, always, even in sleep, especially. Good night.